technology. They were these brilliant and often very cranky critics, academics, and broadcasters who were absolutely convinced they knew how we should all live, think, and feel. Their battlefields were the pages of magazines and the airwaves of the BBC. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the old guard, the guys who stood watch at the gates of high culture. Then we'll meet the rebels who stormed that fortress. After that, we'll see how a wave of pop culture washed everything away, and how the fight shifted to being about power, identity, and this state of constant change we're all living in today. So let's rewind the clock. Back in the early 20th century, the powerful people thought of culture as a kind of fortress, built to protect the best that has been said or thought from all the noise and chaos of the modern world. And you better believe this fortress had some serious gatekeepers. Our first major figure is John Reith, the founder of the BBC. I mean, this guy had an incredible vision. He wanted to use the new magic of radio not just to entertain people, but to educate them, to uplift the entire nation. For Reith, with his deeply religious background, broadcasting the greatest music and literature, well, it wasn't just a job. It was a moral crusade to improve the very soul of Britain. So while Reith wanted to share high culture with everyone, another guy wanted to defend it like his life depended on it. Meet F.R. Leavis, a literary critic from Cambridge, who saw himself as the last man standing against a rising tide of what he saw as cheap, modern vulgarity. To him, great literature wasn't just important, it was basically a religion. And when I say Leavis had a narrow vision, I mean incredibly narrow. In his hugely influential book, The Great Tradition, he basically argued that out of every English novelist who ever lived, only these 4 really mattered. That's it. He believed their books weren't just stories, they were moral training grounds that taught you human awareness and gave you the tools you needed to live a better life. And, well, here is the ugly side of that fortress. This quote is genuinely shocking. It just drips with his deep-seated elitism. He honestly believed that ordinary people, left to their own devices, would just waste their lives on empty, meaningless things. It's this worldview, this sense of crisis, that really sets the stage for the first big battles of the culture war. Of course, Leavis' fortress couldn't stay locked up forever. A whole new generation of thinkers started chipping away at those high walls, arguing that culture wasn't just for a tiny minority. They believed it belonged to everyone. The first real crack in the wall came during the famous two cultures debate, when a physicist named C.P. Snow dared to suggest that, hey, maybe science is just as culturally important as literature. Leavis didn't just disagree. Oh no, he launched one of the most brutal personal attacks in academic history. It was a huge sign that the older order was starting to break. And then Raymond Williams showed up, and he didn't just crack the wall, he took a sledgehammer to it. Williams was a Cambridge professor, but he came from a Welsh working-class family, and he totally changed the game. He argued that culture isn't just the best stuff in a museum. No, culture is a whole way of life. It's found in the everyday habits, the languages, the rituals of ordinary people. Richard Hoggart ran with this idea and basically invented a whole new field called cultural studies. He made the truly radical claim that the complex, rich life of the working class, the sounds of the pub, the local songs, even the taste of fish and chips wrapped in newspaper, was a culture just as deep and worthy of study as a Shakespeare play. The fortress walls were definitely starting to crumble. And then the 1960s happened. The walls didn't just crumble, they got hit by a full-on tsunami of pop culture, roaring in from a super confident, glossy America. All those old stuffy distinctions between high culture and low culture, suddenly they just seemed totally ridiculous. A key player in this brave new world was Susan Sontag. She was kind of like part intellectual, part rock star, and she did something absolutely revolutionary. She took pop culture seriously. She wrote brilliant essays about movies, sci-fi, and camp, treating them with the same intellectual firepower that others saved for classic novels. She was saying, hey, this stuff is legitimate art too. Right around the same time, Marshall McLuhan drops this bomb of an idea. He said everyone was missing the point by arguing about what was on TV. The real revolution, he said, was the television itself. The technology, the medium, was fundamentally changing how our brains work and how we see the world. The content was almost beside the point. The medium was the message. So, with the old fortress now in ruins and pop culture running wild, the battleground shifted once again. The big question wasn't about high versus low culture anymore. Now it was about politics. Thinkers started to pull back the curtain and show how culture was never neutral. It had always been a tool of power. Okay, so 3 key thinkers really drove this home. John Berger showed how classic European art was all tied up with who owned what. C.L.R. James revealed how even a sport like cricket was used by the British Empire to impose its values. And Edward Said argued that the entire Western idea of the Orient was basically a fantasy created to justify colonial power. The takeaway: culture is never separate from politics. So where does all this leave us today? Well, with all the old rules shattered and everything feeling political, the cultural landscape seems chaotic, right? Constantly shifting. One last great thinker looked at this new world and gave it the perfect name. That thinker was Stuart Hall, and he argued that we're not heading towards some new, stable idea of culture. The war is over, because the very idea of a single unified culture is gone for good. We now live, as he brilliantly put it, in a state of permanent revolution. And doesn't that just perfectly describe the world we live in? For Hall, our culture is a giant mishmash, a piece of high art from a museum, a viral TikTok dance, a political ad, a pop song. They all just swirl together in our feeds and in our heads, constantly mixing, colliding, and changing. The war is over, and what's left is this beautiful, chaotic, permanent state of flux. So here's the bottom line. We've gone on this journey from a world where a tiny handful of gatekeepers told everyone what good culture was, to this new reality of permanent revolution and infinite choice. And what that does is it brings this entire century-long war right to your front door. Because in this new world, there's really only one person left who can answer that question on the screen, and that person is you.
Trade smooth even when your network isn't. No buffering, no breaking, just trading. Open free Demat account with Angel One.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
यूपीआई पेमेंट फेल हो गया, इसलिए बर्तन मांजना पड़ रहा है। अकाउंट में बैलेंस नहीं था, दोस्त कह रहा था स्लाइस यूपीआई क्रेडिट कार्ड यूज किया करो। नहीं सुना। सेम यूपीआई जैसे स्कैन करना होता है, बस पैसे आपके अकाउंट से नहीं क्रेडिट कार्ड से कटते हैं। बस नॉर्मल यूपीआई की तरह स्कैन करो, पे करो और बाद में रीपे करो। नो ज्वाइनिंग फी, नो एनुअल फी, नो हिडन चार्ज। ऊपर से हर ट्रांजैक्शन पे अप टू 3% तक का कैशबैक। दोस्त का सुन लेना चाहिए। तो जहाँ पे यूपीआई चलाते हो वहाँ पे स्लाइस चलाओ।
So what's the right way to read a poem? It sounds like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? But about 100 years ago, that very question sparked one of the biggest intellectual battles of the entire 20th century. Today, we are diving deep into that story. Think about it. You've probably been there. You're absolutely convinced a song is about a heartbreaking breakup, but your friend is swearing it's about, I don't know, political revolution. You're both looking at the exact same lyrics, but you're hearing totally different things. It gets personal, right? Well, take that argument, scale it way up, and you've got what happened in the world of literature a century ago. Two of the sharpest minds of the time went head-to-head over that exact same problem, not for pop songs, but for poetry. And their debate, well, it would go on to change how we all learn about literature forever. So in one corner, you had the heavyweight champion of modern poetry, T.S. Eliot. For him, a poem wasn't just an object, it was part of this huge, sprawling tradition. To really get it, you had to know about the author's life, the historical context, everything. But in the other corner was this young, kind of radical Cambridge instructor, I.A. Richards. And he argued the complete opposite. He said, nope, everything you need is right there in the words themselves. Just the text, nothing else. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the problem everyone was struggling with. Then, we'll get into the wild experiment that blew everything up. After that, we'll unpack the awesome new toolkit that came out of it. And finally, we'll see how its legacy is still shaping how you and I read today. So let's set the scene. What did things even look like before this big showdown? Honestly, it was kind of the Wild West. Literary criticism was mostly impressionistic. People would talk about a poem's beauty or its spirit, but it was all based on their personal feelings or some random historical fact. There wasn't a real system to it. And this whole vibe was perfectly captured by the man himself, T.S. Eliot. He basically argued that trying to pick apart why you feel something about a piece of art actually ruins the experience. For him, the connection was supposed to be mysterious, almost sacred, rooted in this deep sense of history, not in our own messy individual interpretations. But then, along comes I.A. Richards, and he looked at all this vague impressionistic stuff and thought, there has to be a better way. He wanted to know what was actually going on inside a reader's head. See, Richards wasn't about vague feelings. He wanted cold, hard data. So he cooked up this experiment at Cambridge that was so simple, so brilliant, it was about to turn the entire literary world completely upside down. His method was just genius. He took 13 poems and handed them out to his students. But, and this is the crucial part, he stripped them of all identifying information. No author's name, no title, no date, nothing. He wanted to isolate the words on the page. And his only instruction was, read these and write down what you think. And the results that came back? Oh, they were a complete and utter train wreck. Richards was stunned. These were supposed to be some of the brightest students in England, and their interpretations were, well, they were all over the map. Wildly off base, totally unsupported by the text. So he started sorting through the mess, and he saw these patterns emerge. He realized people weren't even reading the poem in front of them. They were reacting to their own personal memories. They were falling back on cliché ideas he called stock responses. They were getting swept up in sentimentality or completely missing the author's tone. His experiment proved it. Without a method, readers were just lost in their own heads. But here's the thing about Richards. He didn't just point out the problem and walk away. Nope. He went and built a solution from the ground up. He created an entirely new toolkit for readers. It started with this really key distinction. He said, look, language has two basic jobs. You've got scientific language, which just points to facts, right? Water is H2O. Simple. But poetry uses what he called emotive language. Its job isn't to state facts, but to organize our feelings and attitudes about the facts. It's a totally different beast. So to analyze this emotive language, he broke it down into 4 parts. First, you've got sense. That's just the literal dictionary meaning of the words. What's it saying? Next up is feeling. What's the writer's emotional attitude about the topic? Are they angry, sad, sarcastic? Third is tone. This one's subtle. It's the writer's attitude toward you, the person reading. Are they being friendly, formal, condescending? And finally, there's intention. What's the writer's overall goal? What effect are they trying to create? And here was the masterstroke. He said you can't just look at one of these in isolation. The real meaning, the art of the poem, happens in the interplay between all 4. It's how sense, feeling, tone, and intention all work together, or sometimes push against each other, that creates the poem's total power. This was the system everyone had been missing. And this amazing new toolkit didn't just stay in some Cambridge classroom. Oh no, its legacy would ripple out and completely reshape how literature was taught everywhere. This whole approach became the foundation for a massive intellectual movement called New Criticism. His central idea, focus on the words on the page, became the way to study literature in universities all across the English-speaking world for basically the next 50 years. I mean, you can literally trace the line. 1929, he publishes his groundbreaking book, Practical Criticism. By the 30s and 40s, New Criticism is taking over. And today, the basic technique he invented, what we now call close reading, yep, that's a standard skill taught in pretty much every high school and college English class on the planet. So why does all this matter? What's the big takeaway? It's that Richards basically democratized reading. He took literary analysis out of the exclusive hands of experts who knew all the obscure history and gave a reliable method to any reader, to you and me. He gave us the tools and the confidence to trust our own analysis of the words right in front of us. Which kind of leaves us with a big question for our own time, doesn't it? In this world of endless scrolling, hot takes, and information overload, is there something incredibly valuable in this old idea? Is the patient, careful art of just slowing down and paying attention to the words on the page a skill that we might just need now more than ever?
Excuse me, quick question. आप अपने शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स जैसे
शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स जैसे कि वेकेशन हो गया, कोई नया फोन लेना हो गया, या फिर किसी के लिए कोई बड़ा गिफ्ट लेना।
ओ अच्छा, ऐसे ट्रिप्स तो मैं बहुत लेती हूँ, साल में एटलीस्ट 4 बार।
आप उन ट्रिप्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
एवरी मंथ मेरी सैलरी अकाउंट में हिट होते ही मैं एक पार्ट आरडी में इन्वेस्ट कर देती हूँ।
आरडी मतलब?
रिकरिंग डिपॉजिट्स। जैसे म्यूचुअल फंड्स के दुनिया में एसआईपी होता है, वैसे ही एफडी के दुनिया में आरडी होता है। एवरी मंथ सैलरी का एक पार्ट उसमें इन्वेस्ट हो जाता है और ट्रैवल के लिए भी सेविंग्स हो जाती है।
और ये आरडी आपने कहाँ से करवाई?
स्टेबल मनी ऐप से। यहाँ 7 से 8% तक की हाई इंटरेस्ट वाली सारी आरडीज मिल जाती है, जहाँ पे आप अमाउंट भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो, ड्यूरेशन भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो और यूपीआई सेटअप भी कर सकते हो। कभी स्टॉप करनी है तो स्टॉप भी कर सकते हो। और
All right, let's dive into a really big idea today. One that comes from a book that totally shook up political theory. It's called Empire, written by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. Their whole argument is that there's this new, almost invisible force governing our world, and we're going to try and figure out exactly what that means. And look, this book made some serious waves. When it came out back in 2000, the famous philosopher Slavoj Žižek called it a new manifesto for our time. Now, not everyone agreed. Some critics thought it was a bit out there, but you just couldn't deny its impact. It really forced a global conversation about what power even looks like anymore. So, what is this huge controversial idea at the heart of the book? Well, Hart and Negri basically say that after the old systems of colonialism and even the Cold War faded away, something new rose up to take their place. A whole new structure, a new logic for how the world is run. And they gave it a name: empire. Now, this is absolutely crucial. When they say empire, you can't be thinking about ancient Rome or the British Empire. That's not it at all. They mean a totally new kind of power, one that manages the global flow of everything, from money and goods to culture and ideas. In their view, it's the invisible hand that now governs the entire planet. To really get what empire is, we first have to be super clear on what it isn't. And the authors draw this really important line in the sand between their concept and the old school idea of imperialism. They operated on completely different software, if you will. So here's the deal. Imperialism was always about one country extending its power over another. You know, like the British Empire planting its flag in India. It was all about drawing lines on a map, creating borders, and defining a clear us versus them. But empire as a theory is the total opposite. It doesn't have a single capital city, it has no real borders, and its goal isn't to push people out. Its goal is to pull everyone and everything into its massive global network. This idea of a borderless, all-in system is really the core of their whole argument. So, if the old maps don't work anymore, what does this new world order actually look like? The authors have this really powerful metaphor to explain it. Think about those old world maps from history class, where every colonial power had its own color: British pink, French blue, you name it. They argue that all those colors have now bled together into one single global rainbow. There are no separate empires competing anymore. There's just one giant, all-inclusive system. They also say the world has become smooth. What on earth does that mean? Well, it means those old divisions we used to talk about all the time, first world, second world, third world, they've basically dissolved. They've been flattened out by this one single overarching logic that applies everywhere. So let's just boil it down. 3 key things make this empire so different. First, it's decentered. There's no one capital, no White House or 10 Downing Street running the show. Second, it's deterritorializing, meaning it doesn't care about physical land or geography. And third, it's all-encompassing. It's always expanding, always trying to pull every last corner of the globe into its web. But you gotta ask, right? What's fueling this thing? What's the economic engine behind this new global system? And this is where the theory pivots a little, from pure politics to economics, because they identified a huge shift in how wealth is even made anymore. Think about it this way. Back in the industrial era, value came from factory work, making physical stuff, right? Cars, textiles, widgets. But Hart and Negri argue that in our world, the most valuable kind of labor is now communicative, cooperative, and effective. In other words, our economy runs on creating ideas, information, social networks, and even feelings. Okay, the authors have a very specific, kind of academic-sounding term for this new economic reality. They call it biopolitical production. It sounds a little intimidating, I know, but the idea behind it is actually pretty profound. So this is a heavy one, but let's break it down. Biopolitical production basically means our economy no longer just makes things. It creates and organizes social life itself. The perfect example is social media. The real value there isn't just the website or the app, it's the relationships we build, the data we create, the communities we form. The lines between our economic life, our social life, and our cultural life have just totally blurred, and value is being pulled from all of it. Okay, I know what you might be thinking. This is all fascinating, but it's, super abstract. What does it actually mean for the real world? Why should we care about this idea of a global, borderless empire? Well, for starters, it tackles a question I think a lot of us have these days. What's the deal with individual countries? In this crazy, interconnected world, are nation states still as powerful as they used to be? According to this theory, the answer is a pretty clear no. The authors argue that individual nations have less and less real control over the stuff that crosses their borders, whether we're talking about the trillions of dollars zipping around in global financial markets, the spread of new tech, human migration, or just the stuff we buy online. So here's the punchline. Sovereignty, or the power to rule, didn't just disappear. It just transformed. It morphed into this massive, complex global network. And yeah, that network is made up of countries, for sure, but it also includes huge global bodies like the UN and the IMF, not to mention giant multinational corporations. And the key is they all operate under a single shared logic. And that, of course, brings us to the final, massive question that hangs over all of this. If this theory is even partly right, if we really are living under a decentered, borderless global power that has no true capital, then who or what is actually in charge? The theory gives us a new map for the world, but it kind of leaves us standing in the middle of it, wondering who's driving this thing.
So what if ideology isn't some pair of glasses you can just take off to see the real world? What if it's the real world you're already looking at? Okay, let's dive into this, because today we're deconstructing the totally revolutionary and, pretty mind-bending theory of ideology from the one and only Slavoj Žižek. We're going to start right here with this quote, because this idea gets to the absolute heart of how Žižek thinks. He pulls this from the philosopher Hegel, and the takeaway is this. Conflict, contradiction, these aren't bugs in the system. They aren't problems that need to be solved. They are the very things that make, everything what it is. Just keep that idea in your back pocket, because it's going to change how we look at all of this. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll get to know the man himself. Then we'll have to understand the traditional way of thinking about ideology, the thing he was arguing against. After that, we'll see how that old view got challenged. Then we'll unpack Žižek's own unique philosophical toolkit. And finally, we'll land on his radical conclusion about what ideology really is. So, first up, the philosopher of contradiction. Let's get to know the thinker who set all of this in motion. Okay, so Slavoj Žižek comes onto the scene from the former Yugoslavia. He was part of the circle of thinkers who were fascinated by philosophy, sure, but also by psychoanalysis and popular culture, and how all of it ties into the way ideology works in our day-to-day lives. His huge landmark book from 1989, The Sublime Object of Ideology, that's where he really lays out all the groundbreaking stuff we're digging into today. He's famous for mashing up high-level philosophy with deep psychoanalytic thought to critique everything from totalitarianism to capitalism. Now, to really appreciate how big of a deal Žižek's idea is, we first have to understand what he was breaking away from. And that brings us to the old-school, traditional view of ideology, which is all wrapped up in this idea of false consciousness. For the longest time, the standard Marxist idea was, pretty straightforward. Ideology was basically seen as an illusion, a kind of veil that's pulled over everyone's eyes. The whole theory was that this big illusion was just there to hide the real conflicts in society, which back then were thought to be all about money and class struggle. It was a simple picture. You just weren't seeing things as they really are. But eventually, that view started to feel a little too simple. And this is what led to the post-Marxist challenge, which was an attempt to move past this basic idea of a simple illusion. This is a really interesting shift to look at. On the one hand, you had traditional Marxism, which saw economics as the master key to everything. The logic was, if you solved the class war, then all the other problems, racism, sexism, you name it, they would all just sort of disappear. But then the post-Marxists came along and said, hold on a minute. They broke with that logic. They started arguing that other struggles, like feminism or anti-racism, were just as fundamental, maybe even more fundamental than class. But here's the thing. For Žižek, even this didn't quite get to the heart of the problem. So this is the moment where Žižek forges his own path. he decides the old tools aren't working. So he turns to two absolute giants of thought, the philosopher Hegel and the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, to build a completely new way of understanding ideology. And this brings us back to Hegel. For Zizek, people had been getting Hegel all wrong for years. He said that Hegel's famous dialectic isn't some happy little story about people working through their conflicts to reach a perfect, happy ending. No way. For Zizek, Hegel's philosophy is actually about fully accepting that failure, antagonism, and contradiction are essential, permanent parts of reality itself. They never go away. And you can see his entire game plan laid out perfectly right here from his key book. Step 1, he brings in the psychoanalytic ideas of Jacques Lacan. Step 2, he uses Lacan like a new pair of glasses to go back and reread Hegel, finding this deep embrace of difference and contradiction. And finally, step 3, he takes this powerful new Hegel plus Lacan combo to create a brand new theory of ideology, one that's designed for a world that wrongly thinks it's already past ideology. Okay, so all of that buildup brings us to the main event, the big payoff. This is the radical solution to the whole problem of ideology. This is the point that changes everything. And there it is. This is Zizek's central claim. Let's really let it sink in. Ideology isn't a false story about reality. It's not a distorted view. Ideology is our social reality. And here's the crazy part. It only works because we, the people living in it, don't realize what it truly is. So let's break down what that actually means. It means you can't just step outside of ideology to get a clear, true view of the world. Why? Because the very ground you're standing on is ideological. It's the fabric of our social world. It's all the unspoken rules, the hidden assumptions, the entire structure of society that we just take for granted. It works not by tricking us with lies, but by shaping our reality so completely that we don't even know to ask questions about it. And that is the profound and, pretty unsettling question that Zizek leaves us chewing on. If ideology isn't something we believe in, but something we do, something we just live inside of without even knowing it, is there any way out? Or is the best we can ever hope for just to get a little bit better at seeing the walls of the prison we're already...
Your wardrobe refreshes with trending styles faster than I can refresh my feed. But kaise?
With freshly found on Myntra. See, for everything you heart online, you can just add the cart on Myntra.
Ooh, one app with everything trending?
Yeah.
I love it. Can I double tap this?
Of course.
All right, so today we're jumping right into a pretty intense debate that's been happening in the world of literary studies. Some people are even calling it a crisis, a real battle for the soul of how we read and talk about literature. And this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures this feeling, doesn't it? It's dramatic, for sure, but it gets at this growing sense that something has gone fundamentally off the rails in the way we study books. So what is this crisis, really? Well, you've got critics like Roger Kimball and others who are basically saying that the very integrity of literature, what makes it special, is being attacked from the inside, from within the academy itself. At the heart of it all is this one big accusation, that ideology has completely taken over. The argument is that the focus has shifted away from the art, the beauty and the craft of the work, and instead it's all about pushing a political agenda. Okay, so the main villain in this story, for a lot of these critics, is this broad concept called theory. Now look, theory didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It came from a genuine desire to ask some tough, important questions about power and language and society. But for its opponents, this whole approach just ended up changing the game completely. Critics like Geoffrey Harpham, they point to this project of theory as like ground zero. A big part of it was this idea of the death of the author. And what that means basically is that what the author intended to say was no longer the most important thing. And for these critics, that shift pulled all the attention away from the art itself. And in their view, it kind of killed what made literature so exciting in the first place. And this led to a really interesting kind of trippy concept called generalized textuality. The idea is that literature just got swallowed up. Imagine this giant, swirling, glossy vortex of words and information. Advertisements, speeches, historical documents, you name it. In this massive sea of texts, literature lost what made it special, its unique aesthetic specificity. It became just another drop in the ocean. So you can see how critics saw this as a domino effect, right? It wasn't just one thing. It was this whole chain reaction that they felt was really hurting the field. Literary study, in their eyes, became less about appreciating art and more about, well, political sparring, often wrapped up in really dense, almost impossible to read jargon. But this didn't just happen in a vacuum. Of course not. A really powerful counter-movement started to bubble up, one that called for a return to the aesthetic, a return to appreciating literature as literature. And this offered a completely different vision for what literary study should be. And this right here, this is the whole ballgame. It's a fundamental clash over why we even read books in the first place. Is the goal to change the world politically, or is it to understand other people? Is art just a tool of the powerful, or can it actually challenge power? You can see these two camps have totally different answers for everything. And this isn't just some abstract idea, you know? There are real influential scholars pushing this. You've got Jeffrey Harfum, who's saying, hey, let's get back to the book itself. Then there's Helen Wendler, who's all about the unique magic of language and form. And a guy we're going to focus on a bit, George Levine, sees the aesthetic as this crucial protected space of freedom. And this quote from George Levine really gets to the heart of his vision. He imagines the aesthetic as a kind of protected space, a sanctuary, you could say, where we can step away from the constant grind of political and ideological battles to just experience something else. Yeah, he's really talking about freedom here. Think about it, a space for free play. Imagine a place for exploration, for creativity, for possibility. Levine believes that art offers one of the last places for that kind of open-ended thinking, and he's worried those spaces are shrinking in our world. Okay, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds like some stuffy academic debate that doesn't really affect me. But honestly, the fallout from this argument goes way beyond university walls. It really touches on how all of us think about and value art in our lives. So for someone like Levine, the aesthetic isn't about escaping reality. It's actually a super unique way of engaging with it. It all starts with this idea of disinterest. Now, that doesn't mean you don't care. It means you try to set aside your own baggage, your own biases, so you can really truly see something from another point of view. And from there, you get empathy. And you start to see how art can actually challenge power in ways you didn't expect. And really, this is the mic drop for this side of the argument. At the end of the day, they believe art's greatest power isn't about winning a political debate. It's about empathy. It's about giving us that vital sense of the other, connecting us to lives and feelings that are completely different from our own. And that brings us right back to the big central question here. And it's not just for scholars, it's for every single one of us. When you pick up a book or stand in front of a painting, what are you really looking for? Are you looking for a tool for social change or a refuge from it? A weapon or a window into another soul? How you answer that, well, that changes everything.
सर ₹1 आप सीखो ऐप को देके डेली का 3000 कमाना सीख सकते हैं। अगर बिल गेट्स कर सकते हैं, रतन टाटा कर सकते हैं, राकेश झुंझुनवाला कर सकते हैं, तो आप भी कर सकते हो। बस हार नहीं माननी है और रोज सीखो ऐप से सीखते रहना। आप रील देखने में दिन के 4-5 घंटे तो वेस्ट करते ही होंगे। एक दिन में 5 घंटे मतलब एक हफ्ते में 35 घंटे, एक महीने में 6 दिन और एक साल में 2.5 महीने। अब सोचो वो 2.5 महीने अगर आपने सीखो ऐप पे बिताए होते तो अब तक आप पार्ट टाइम इनकम कमाने के 5-6 परमानेंट तरीके तो जरूर सीख गए होते। ये तरीके आप YouTube पर भी ढूंढ सकते हो, लेकिन YouTube पर आपको सही वीडियो ढूंढने में बहुत टाइम लग जाएगा और बीच में कुछ यहाँ वहाँ के वीडियो देखने में भी टाइम वेस्ट हो जाएगा। सीखो ऐप पर ऐसा नहीं है। सीखो भी एक ऐसी ऐप है जहाँ पे वीडियोस आते हैं, लेकिन उसमें काम का वीडियो तुरंत ही मिल जाता है, क्योंकि वहाँ पे सिर्फ ऐसे वीडियोस ही अलाउड हैं जिनसे आप कुछ सीख सको। YouTube का क्या है, वहाँ तो कोई भी कुछ भी वीडियो डाल सकता है। आपको तो वीडियो देखने के बाद ही पता चलेगा ना कि वो काम का था या नहीं। वहीं दूसरी तरफ सीखो ऐप का वीडियो 100% काम का होता है। सीखो की टीम पहले वेरीफाई करती है कि जो आदमी वीडियो बना रहा है वो कोई एक्सपर्ट भी है या नहीं, और फिर अगर वीडियो में जेन्युइन जानकारी होती है तभी वो ऐप पर आता है। इसका मतलब आप सीखो ऐप पर जो पेड वर्क ऐप से डॉलर कमाने का तरीका सीखेंगे वो एकदम सही होगा। और इतना ही नहीं, पार्ट टाइम इनकम के तरीकों के साथ साथ आप बिजनेस, स्टॉक मार्केट और इंग्लिश स्पीकिंग भी सीख सकते हो।
इंस्टॉल नाउ पे क्लिक करो और अभी सीखो ऐप डाउनलोड करो।
भाई अब
विंटर में तुम ये लेमिनेशन वाली स्लाइडर तो पहन नहीं सकते, क्योंकि भाई अब विंटर आ जाएंगे और तुम्हें चाहिए होंगे एस्थेटिक दिखने वाले शूज और स्नीकर। इसलिए मैं तुम्हारे लिए सिर्फ 300-400 में ऐसे कमाल के स्नीकर लेके आ चुका हूँ जो तुम्हें स्टाइलिश एस्थेटिक दिखाने का पूरा काम करेंगे। इसलिए भाई जल्दी से कमेंट में विंटर टाइप करके आप इन सभी का लिंक ले लो।
So, what if everything you've ever been told about high art is just, well, a carefully constructed myth? What if the idea that a certain painting or a symphony can make you a better, more moral person is just an extravagant claim? We're about to dive into the work of a man who dared to ask those exact questions. And trust me, his answers might just change the way you look at art forever. We're kicking things off with this quote because, honestly, it's the core of the entire argument. John Kerry, a total giant in the world of literary criticism, just drops this bombshell. There is no absolute standard or value of art. Just let that sink in for a second. He's saying there's no universal yardstick, no objective measure that makes one piece of art better than another. Okay, so is that the end game here? If there's no objective value, is he basically saying it's all meaningless? Well, not quite. And the real answer is actually way more interesting than a simple yes or no. To really get what he's saying, we first have to tackle what he calls the myth of high art. This is Kerry throwing down the gauntlet and directly challenging the entire art establishment. Here it is, the central point of his book. What good are the arts? He argues that this idea that art has some kind of special spiritual power, that looking at a Monet can literally improve you as a person, is a total construct. He's not saying art isn't fun or beautiful. He's just saying these huge claims about its moral benefits are, well, they're wildly overblown. Now, you're probably wondering, who is this guy making such incredibly bold claims? Is he some kind of outsider trying to tear down the walls? Well, this is where it gets really, really interesting. Everybody, meet John Kerry. And here's the thing, he's not an outsider at all. In fact, he is the ultimate insider, which, makes his whole argument all the more powerful. I mean, just look at these credentials. We're talking about a former Oxford professor, the guy who chaired the super prestigious Booker Prize Committee, and he edited the definitive edition of Milton's poetry. This isn't just some random opinion. It's coming from someone at the absolute peak of the literary world. And this right here is the brilliant paradox of John Kerry. He is a card-carrying member of the intellectual elite whose entire mission is basically anti-elitism. He believes big, complex ideas should be for everyone, explained in plain, simple language. And this whole anti-elitist thing wasn't some phase he went through late in life. Nope. It's been the foundation of his work for decades, built by rigorously going back and re-examining all the literary classics. If you really want to see how he got to this radical place, you've got to look at his career. He spent decades questioning the established takes on literary giants. From Dickens to Thackeray to John Donne, he was constantly challenging the conventional wisdom, peeling back all those layers of myth to get to a much more complex truth. And this wasn't just some academic exercise, His work had a real impact. For example, his book on John Donne completely transformed how people saw the poet, turning him from some stuffy historical figure into this really complex, modern-feeling thinker. When a mind that sharp turns to the very definition of art itself, you really have to listen. So if Kerry is tearing down the idea of high art, does he leave anything standing? He does. After questioning art in general, he makes this fascinating, very specific claim for one art form in particular. Yeah, he argues that not all arts are created equal. It's wild. He spends an entire book taking art off its pedestal, only to then build a brand new one just for his own field. And he's not shy about it at all. Kerry's big conclusion is that literature is unique. It's not just another art form on the list. He truly believes it holds a superior position, and for very clear, definable reasons. So here's the crucial distinction. Kerry argues that a painting or a piece of music, it can't argue with you. It can't critique itself. But literature can. It's the only art form that can actually reason, that can question things, and even criticize its own ideas. Okay, so where does all this leave us? What's the big takeaway from Kerry's whole intellectual journey? What actually makes any piece of art good? Right, let's just quickly recap his logic. He starts by saying there's no universal standard for good art. From there, it follows that its value can't be decided by some small group of experts. But then, he makes that special case for literature because of its unique ability for critical thought. And ultimately, this is what's so important. By taking away the authority of the expert, Carey empowers us, the audience. He's basically saying a work of art is good if it's good for you. Its value is personal, it's subjective. It's not about what you're told you should like. It's about what genuinely moves you or challenges you. And that leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. Carey forces us to confront our own relationship with culture. So the next time you're in a museum or you're reading a classic, ask yourself, is this great because somebody told me it is, or is it great because it actually speaks to me? And according to Carey, the answer is entirely up to you.
ETF, a practical approach to build your investment portfolio with Angel One. Open free Demat account now.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing. Choose from thousands of realistic voices to use in your content. Change the way you record podcasts, voiceovers, and branded content with the #1 AI-powered voice-generating technology. Stop searching for the perfect voice and stop wasting time re-recording take after take. Try 11 Labs for free and start elevating your content today.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a pretty challenging idea from the academic Elaine Scarry. It's this: the more you know, the greater your duty is to actually do something. It's a concept that flips expertise on its head, turning it from a kind of privilege into a serious responsibility. And this quote just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? For Scarry, knowing a lot isn't a pass to just sit on the sidelines and observe. No, it's a call to action. It means you have to engage, you have to question, and you have to participate even more, not less. So who is the person behind such a powerful statement? Let's get to know the scholar who pretty consistently steps out of the university and right into the middle of public debate. You know, on paper, Elaine Scarry is an English professor, but that's just the beginning of the story. In practice, she has become one of the sharpest and sometimes most controversial critics of state power out there, using her academic mind to tackle the biggest political questions of our time. Okay, to really get where she's coming from with all her political work, we actually have to go back to this groundbreaking book she wrote in 1985. It really laid the foundation for everything that came after. And this is it: The Body in Pain. It might not sound like a political book at first, but trust me, this is where it all starts. In it, Scarry dives deep into how physical suffering can literally shatter a person's entire world. Her whole analysis of pain, the body, and power becomes the lens she uses to examine politics later on. This brings us to a really crucial idea from her book, The Unmaking of the World. For Scarry, an act like torture isn't just about causing harm. It's about completely dismantling a person's reality. It's about wiping out their language, their beliefs, and this is the key, their ability to give consent. And that idea, consent, becomes absolutely central to everything else she talks about. So let's see how this foundation builds into some pretty direct challenges to government policy. This is her putting that whole theory of increased obligation into practice. And just look at the range here, seriously. From the fallout of 9/11 to the insane logic of nuclear war, Scarry has taken her intellectual framework and applied it to this huge spectrum of really high-stakes issues, places where that relationship between the government and the citizen really gets put to the test. Now, this is probably one of her most pointed critiques. Scarry makes this hugely controversial argument that the Patriot Act isn't an expression of patriotism at all. She says it's an abuse of it. For her, true patriotism is defending your country's founding principles, its democratic ideals, the very things she argues the act tears down. And following that logic leads you to a pretty startling place. Scarry suggests that when a government starts to undermine its own founding principles, its own constitution, it can become a real threat to its own people. I mean, that is a stark and really provocative claim to make. So here's the crucial point. All of these arguments that seem kind of separate, on torture, on war, on the Patriot Act, they all connect back to one single deep concern for her. Her work really forces us all to ask this fundamental question. What is the absolute bedrock of a democratic society? And for Scarry, the answer circles right back to her early work on pain and the body. Her logic is actually laid out pretty clearly right here. Okay, so step 1. The heart of democracy is the consent of the governed. We agree to be led. Step 2. Acts like torture or the decision to launch nuclear weapons have absolutely nothing to do with consent. 0. So step 3, her conclusion, these things are profoundly undemocratic. By their very nature, they operate in a world where consent is just impossible. It's not even part of the equation.
So this brings us to the final, and maybe the most important takeaway from all of Scary's work. It's not just some academic theory, it's a direct challenge to all of us. Because ultimately, Scary's message isn't just for professors. It's a call to action for every single informed citizen. Her work argues that we all have a duty to use what we know to question power and to fiercely protect the principle of consent, because that's the cornerstone of a democracy.
And that leaves us with this final thought, doesn't it? In an age where we have more access to information than at any point in human history, Scary's work asks a direct question to each and every one of us. If knowledge creates obligation, then what is our duty of citizenship? Right now, today.
Mintra, fashion shopping app. Get it today.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain on something you deal with every single day: popular culture. We're going to explore how the movies you watch, the music you love, well, how it all may be doing a lot more than just entertaining you. We're diving into the pretty fascinating world of cultural studies. But before we get into the really big ideas, let me just ask you this. Think about the last show you binge watched. You know, the one you absolutely could not stop watching. Or that one song that's been stuck in your head for weeks. Have you ever stopped to wonder if it's actually more than just a good time? That's the exact question we're digging into today. So, how could your favorite movie literally change your reality? Well, to answer that, we've got to get the basics down first. So let's start with the big one. What in the world is cultural studies anyway? To put it simply, cultural studies makes a pretty bold claim that culture doesn't just reflect our lives, it actively shapes them. It's all about investigating that link between culture and power, and how that connection plays out in everything, from who we think we are to how our entire society functions. And listen, when we say culture, don't just picture some fancy painting in a museum. In cultural studies, culture is, well, it's basically everything. We're talking blockbuster movies, pop songs, whatever's going viral on social media, even fashion magazines. The argument is that all this stuff can tell us just as much about our world as some classic novel. It's all part of the same big conversation. Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting. One of the first major ideas to come out of cultural studies was kind of dark. It proposed that pop culture isn't just fun and games. It's actually a tool of control, and it's coming from the top down. This quote comes from two really influential thinkers, Adorno and Horkheimer. They were part of a group known as the Frankfurt School. And way back in the 1940s, they looked around at the rise of mass media, radio, movies, and they saw something that genuinely worried them. They saw this huge, synchronized machine that they called the culture industry. So here's the breakdown of what they were arguing. First, they said that culture was becoming totally standardized, like it was being pumped out of a factory. Second, they believed this whole system was designed to keep us docile and passive, to stop us from thinking too critically. And finally, they felt that art was losing its soul, becoming just another product to be bought and sold. It's a pretty bleak picture, right? But come on, is it really that simple? Are we all just mindless drones consuming whatever's put in front of us? Well, not everyone thought so. In fact, a whole new wave of thinkers came along with a completely different take. Now, this new idea didn't just appear out of thin air. It started building with thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, and then it really took off at what's called the Birmingham School. Scholars there, like the brilliant Stuart Hall, they just completely flipped the script. Instead of asking how culture controls people, they started asking, wait a minute, how do people use culture? They looked at youth subcultures like punk, for example, and analyzed how they'd take mainstream fashion and totally twist it into something new, something rebellious. So you basically got these two opposing camps. You have the Frankfurt School, which saw this top-down system of absolute control, and then you have the Birmingham School, which saw a bottom-up movement of resistance. For them, culture wasn't a prison cell. It was a battleground for ideas. So, who's right? Which one is it? Well, as you can probably guess, the real answer is, it's complicated. And that's pretty much where modern cultural critics jump at. Yeah, most experts today wouldn't just pick a side. Modern analysis is all about exploring that tension, that constant push and pull between the giant culture industry and all of us who consume it. It's like this complex dance between being controlled and pushing back. Just look at these two examples. You have Janice Radway, who studied romance novel readers. And what she found was that these women were using the books to carve out a little space for themselves, a form of personal resistance. But then on the flip side, you have Susan Bordeaux, who argues that popular culture has this incredibly powerful and often negative impact on women's body image. See? You can see both sides of that debate happening right there. And of course, the toolbox for studying this stuff has gotten way bigger. For instance, some critics use something called semiotics, where they look at a TV show almost like it's its own language, with codes and rules that we all subconsciously learn to understand. Others use sociology to show that our taste, what we think is good art or cool music, isn't just personal. It's very often tied to our social background. Okay, so what's the big takeaway here? Why does any of this matter today when we are literally swimming in media 24/7? Here's the bottom line. Culture is never just entertainment. It's one of the main places, maybe the main place, where we all struggle over big ideas about meaning, identity, and power. The stories we watch, read, and listen to every single day are actively shaping how we see the world and how we see ourselves in it. So I'm going to leave you with this question. The next time you're scrolling through your feed or watching a movie or listening to a song, just ask yourself, am I just consuming this culture or am I creating it too? Because the truth is, you're probably doing both. And realizing that, well, that's a really powerful thing.
YouTube पर तो कोई भी कुछ भी वीडियो बना लेता है, कोई रोक तो थोड़ी है। लेकिन सीखो पर पूरी एक टीम बैठी है जो ये चेक करती है कि जो वीडियो बना रहा है वो एक्सपर्ट है कि नहीं, और जो वीडियो में बोला है वो सही बोला है कि नहीं। तब जाकर वीडियो सीखो पर आता है। मतलब सीखो ऐप पर अगर वीडियो है तो उसकी जानकारी एकदम सॉलिड ही होगी। भाई, ये रील और यूट्यूब पे टाइम वेस्ट करना बंद करो। अगर रोज कुछ नया सीखना चाहते हो तो सीखो ऐप डाउनलोड कर लो।
इंस्टॉल नाउ पे क्लिक करो और अभी सीखो ऐप डाउनलोड करो।
Looking for a smarter way to analyze and place your FN orders? Just switch to Grow's advanced option sheet. एक ही स्क्रीन पर ओपन इंटरेस्ट, ग्रीक्स और वॉलेटिलिटी एनालाइज करो, फिर वहीं से डायरेक्टली स्ट्राइक चूज करो और बास्केट और नॉर्मल ऑर्डर प्लेस कर दो विदाउट स्विचिंग स्क्रीन। अपनी ट्रेडिंग ग्रो करो और ऐप डाउनलोड करो।
Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
You know, what if I told you that philosophy wasn't just some abstract, dusty subject, but an actual practical blueprint for building a better, more just world? Well, today we're exploring the work of a philosopher who does exactly that. She's an architect for justice, and her materials are rooted in our shared humanity. It really all starts with one of the biggest, oldest, and maybe toughest questions humanity has ever asked itself. How should one live? I mean, think about it. It's a question that has echoed through centuries, and honestly, it feels more relevant today than ever before. And it's the very question that fuels the work of Martha Nussbaum, one of the most important and influential philosophers working today. She takes this ancient puzzle and uses it to design a totally modern architecture for justice. So to really get her vision, we first have to look at the foundation she's building on. And it's a really powerful idea, one that's rooted in a deep, profound sense of our shared humanity. At the very core of her thought is this concept, universalism. Nussbaum makes the case that, despite all our different cultures and backgrounds, there are some fundamental ideals, like justice, like tolerance, that can and absolutely should apply to everyone, everywhere. It's an incredibly inclusive and powerful place to start. So where does she get this big idea from? Well, she goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. She revitalizes this classic question from Aristotle, what is the good life? But she's not just looking to the past for nostalgia, she's grabbing that ancient wisdom and putting it to work to solve very modern problems. All right, so with that humanistic foundation firmly in place, let's take a look at the actual blueprints, her major works. This is where she really lays out the architectural plans for what a just society could look like. Her 1986 book, The Fragility of Goodness, is what really put her on the map. In it, she draws from Greek tragedy to explore how our well-being is just so vulnerable to things outside our control. Things like pure luck and circumstance. And this idea, this human fragility, becomes a cornerstone for why we need a just society in the first place, to protect our ability to flourish. Then, fast forward to cultivating humanity. Here, she argues that a liberal arts education is absolutely essential for modern life. It's not some kind of luxury, but a vital tool for developing critical thinking and the kind of empathetic imagination we need to become true citizens of the world. And she doesn't just keep these ideas in the abstract. In Sex and Social Justice, she gets really specific. She uses that universalist lens to challenge cultural relativism, arguing that issues like female genital mutilation or unequal pay are injustices everywhere. This really helped pave the way for a truly global feminism. Her project just keeps expanding. In Frontiers of Justice, she pushes the boundaries of traditional theories to include justice for non-human animals and for people with disabilities. This is where she fully develops her famous capabilities approach, basically arguing that real justice isn't just about rights on paper, it's about making sure every single individual has the real opportunity to do and be the things that make for a good human life. Okay, so we've seen the foundation and we've looked over the blueprints, but how do we actually build this thing? How do we construct this more just world? Well, this is where Nussbaum gives us a practical toolkit for change. Her toolkit has 3 essential instruments inside. First, a genuinely liberal education that teaches us how to think, not what to think. Second, the power you find in literature and philosophy to help us imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And third, and this is a big one, a powerful connection between our emotions and our reason. Now, this is so interesting because for centuries, people have pitted emotion against reason. But Nussbaum completely reframes it. For her, they're not enemies, they're partners. Emotion is the engine. It's what gives us the power, the motivation to even care about justice. But an engine without a steering wheel is dangerous, right? So reason is the compass, guiding that powerful engine in a productive, ethical direction. You absolutely need both. So let's say we do all this. We use the toolkit, we follow the blueprints. What does the final structure actually look like? What's the ultimate vision for this grand architecture of justice? Well, it's clear, it's bold, and it's incredibly ambitious. The goal is nothing less than universal peace, universal tolerance, and universal justice. And for Nussbaum, these 3 ideals are completely linked. You can't really truly have one without the other 2. They're the 3 pillars of the whole structure. Okay, I know this all might sound a little grand and philosophical, so let's bring it right back down to earth. Why does this architecture, this whole way of thinking, actually matter in our world? Right here, right now. Because here's the bottom line. Nussbaum's work teaches us that you can have all the laws and policies in the world, but that's not enough. A truly just society isn't just built on paper. It's constructed inside each and every one of us through cultivating empathy, through critical thinking, and through a genuine, deep understanding of other people. You know, her entire project really suggests that the grand, epic work of building a just world out there, well, it actually starts with the personal, quiet work of cultivating our own humanity in here. And that's a powerful thought to leave you with. Where does the
Enhance your trading potential with customized option chains. Analyze stock movements. Make informed trades. Open free demat account.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Excuse me,
Yes.
क्या आपको घूमना पसंद है?
हाँ बिल्कुल.
तो आपकी फेवरेट डेस्टिनेशन कौन सी है?
गोवा तो है ही, बट इंटरनेशनल में इट हैज टू बी बाली.
ओके, तो आप साल में कितनी ट्रिप करते हैं?
साल में 4 बार हो जाता है, 3 बार डोमेस्टिक एंड 1 बार इंटरनेशनल.
और आप इन ट्रिप्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
एवरी मंथ मेरी सैलरी अकाउंट में हिट होते ही मैं एक पार्ट आरडी में इन्वेस्ट कर देती हूँ.
आरडी मतलब?
रिकरिंग डिपॉजिट्स. जैसे म्यूचुअल फंड्स के दुनिया में एसआईपी होता है, वैसे ही एफडी के दुनिया में आरडी होता है. एवरी मंथ सैलरी का एक पार्ट उसमें इन्वेस्ट हो जाता है और ट्रैवल के लिए भी सेविंग्स हो जाती है.
और ये आरडी आपने कहाँ से करवाई?
स्टेबल मनी ऐप से. यहाँ 7 से 8% तक की हाई इंटरेस्ट वाली सारी आरडीज मिल जाती है, जहाँ पे आप अमाउंट भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो, ड्यूरेशन भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो और यूपीआई सेटअप भी कर सकते हो. कभी स्टॉप करनी है तो स्टॉप भी कर सकते हो और पैसे विड्रॉल भी कर सकते हो. तो अब आप भी अपनी नेक्स्ट वेकेशन के लिए आरडी सेटअप करो ओनली ऑन स्टेबल मनी ऐप.
Have you ever stopped to think about how a voice gets heard? And I don't just mean one person's voice, but the voice of an entire culture. Well, today we're diving deep into that very idea. We're going to follow a theory's journey, guided by one of the greatest scholars of our time, to understand how a critical tradition is actually born. And really, it all boils down to this one huge question. How does a culture, especially a culture that's been systematically pushed to the margins, literally write itself into existence? It's a powerful idea, right? To even begin to tackle that, we're going to lean on the incredible work of Henry Louis Gates Jr. You see, his whole project was about mapping out this rich heritage of African American literature and criticism. And in doing that, he gave us this amazing framework to understand how it all happened. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to follow the exact path that Gates laid out, this clear 4-stage journey. We'll start with something called the Black aesthetic, move through how theory was first imitated and then critiqued, and see how it all comes together in a final synthesis. And it all connects back to that big idea of writing a people into being. So yeah, let's jump in. Okay, first up, charting the course. Now, Gates made this really important point. The development of African American criticism wasn't just some random series of events. Nope. He saw a clear evolution, a progression through 4 very specific stages. And what's really cool is he saw this journey as basically mirroring his own growth as a critic. And this is what that roadmap looks like. It all kicks off with the politically charged Black aesthetic. From there, it moves into these phases he calls repetition and imitation, and then repetition and difference, before it all culminates in this powerful final stage, synthesis. Let's break down that first one. All right, let's start at the very beginning. Stage 1, the Black aesthetic. So what exactly was this? Well, it was a really passionate attempt by theorists to define what makes Black art, well, Black. This wasn't just art for art's sake. Not at all. It was directly and deeply tied to the political and social movements of the era, specifically the struggle for Black power. The whole point was to build a framework for criticism that was, in Gates's words, genuinely Black. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. The main question people were asking wasn't just, hey, is this a good book? It was, what is the function of this book in the larger struggle for Black power? Art and politics were completely woven together. But, the conversation couldn't just stop there. It had to evolve. And that brings us to the second stage Gates identified, a huge shift actually, and one that he was a big part of. This was the stage of, you could say, imitation, of engaging with the established tools of literary theory. What's so fascinating here is how the focus completely changes. Black critics started picking up the dominant European theories of the day, things like formalism and structuralism. And for the first time, the spotlight wasn't just on the political message, but on the language of the text itself, like the real nuts and bolts of how the words and sentences were put together. Okay, this slide right here is the absolute pivot point of the whole journey. Pay attention to this. In stage 2, on the left, it's about borrowing a tool to analyze Black literature. Simple enough, but look what happens in stage 3. The whole thing is about to get flipped on its head. And that leads us right into the third stage, what Gates calls repetition and difference. This is where things get really, really interesting and a lot more critical. So the huge leap here is moving from just using the tools to actually testing them. Critics started to realize that when you apply these big mainstream theories to Black literature, sometimes the theories just didn't work. They fell short. So they started using the incredible richness of Black texts to expose the blind spots and the biases inside those very theories. This quote just sums it up perfectly. It becomes a two-way street. Of course, you're still analyzing the book, but you're also using that book to put the theory itself under the microscope. It's a massive shift from just being a consumer of theory to becoming a producer of critique. And all of this work, all this critique, it sets the stage for the grand finale of this whole intellectual journey, synthesis. This is the part where everything we've talked about comes together to create something totally new and powerful. So what does this synthesis look like? Well, think of it as having 3 key ingredients. First, it has to be deeply rooted in the Black vernacular, the unique cultural language and traditions. Second, it's not in a bubble. It's smart, and it's in conversation with all the other big theories out there. And third, what you end up with is a theory that can stand on its own 2 feet, but still connect to the wider world of criticism. And that's it. That is the destination. A unique, powerful critical lens that is totally authentic to African American traditions, but at the same time, it's sophisticated enough to sit at the table and engage with any other theory in the world. It's independent, but it's also connected. A lens that is totally authentic to African American traditions, but at the same time, it's sophisticated enough to sit at the table and engage with any other theory in the world. It's independent, but it's also connected. So, let's bring this all home. We've walked through this whole journey. But why does it really matter? What's the big impact of creating this very specific, synthesized, critical voice? What's the so what? Well, because for Gates, this was never just some dry academic exercise. For Black authors who were historically and systematically told they lacked humanity, the act of writing wasn't a hobby. It was an act of survival. It was how you asserted your identity, your intelligence, your very existence. And this right here, this is the heart of everything. It's just such a profound act of reclamation. Imagine taking the very tool that was used to oppress you, the language that defined you as an absence, as nothing, and turning it, flipping it, and making it the ultimate sign of your presence. Which kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. Gates's framework, it doesn't just explain how some literary theory evolved. It tells a story of what it actually means to find a voice. Not just for one person, but for an entire culture, against incredible odds. It shows us that finding a voice isn't just about speaking, it's about building the entire world, the entire intellectual framework that will make sure you are finally truly heard. Myntra, fashion shopping app. Download now.
இந்த வீடியோ பார்க்குற நீங்க ஒரு காலேஜ் பசங்களா இருக்கீங்கன்னா ஸ்கிப் பண்ணிடாதீங்க, அப்புறம் சத்தியமா வருத்தப்படுவீங்க. பிகாஸ் இந்த வீடியோல ஸ்பெசிஃபிக்கா காலேஜ் பசங்க யூஸ் பண்ற மாதிரி 2 விஷயம் எடுத்து வந்திருக்கேன். ஸோ வீடியோ ஃபுல்லா பாருங்க. ஃபர்ஸ்ட் பாத்தீங்கன்னா இந்த ஹை டாப் கேன்வாஸ் டைப் லேஸ் ஆஃப் ஸ்னீக்கர். இந்த ஸ்னீக்கர் பாத்தீங்கன்னா பிளாக், ஒயிட், ப்ளூன்னு சொல்லி டோட்டலா 3 கலர் வேரியன்ட்ல வருது. சைஸ்மே பாத்தீங்கன்னா அப் டு 10 வரைக்கும் இருக்கும். இந்த காலேஜ்ல ஃபார்மல்ஸ் இல்லாம அதிகமா கேஷுவல்ஸ் யூஸ் பண்ண அலோவ் பண்ணுவாங்கன்னா செக்குடு ஷர்ட், பிளாக் பேண்ட் எல்லாம் போட்டு இந்த ஸ்னீக்கரை போட்டீங்கன்னா டாப் நாச்சா இருக்கும். இதோட ஹீல் பாத்தீங்கன்னா சரௌண்டிங் ஃபுல்லாமே 1 இன்ச்ல இருக்கும். சோ பாக்குறதுக்கு கொஞ்சம் யூனிக்கா தெரியும். செகண்ட் பாத்தீங்கன்னா இந்த ஹை டாப் கேஷுவல் லேஸ் ஆஃப் ஸ்னீக்கர். ஸ்பெசிஃபிக்கா கேஷுவல்ஸ்க்கு மட்டுமே நம்ம தாராளமா இதை யூஸ் பண்ணிக்கலாம். பிகாஸ் இதோட அவுட்டர் லேயர் பாத்தீங்கன்னா பிளாக், ஒயிட்னு சொல்லி யூனிவர்சல் கலர்ல வரதுனால உங்ககிட்ட இருக்க மோஸ்ட் ஆஃப் த ட்ரெஸ் கூட இந்த ஒரு ஷூ நீங்க மேட்ச் பண்ணிக்க முடியும். சைஸும் பாத்தீங்கன்னா அப் டு 10 வரைக்கும் இருக்கும். இந்த 2 ஷூவுமே 70 to 80% ஆஃபர்ல சேல் ஆயிட்டு இருக்கு. சோ நீங்களும் காலேஜ்ல கொஞ்சம் யூனிக்கா தெரியணும்னா என்ன ஃபாலோ பண்ணிட்டு ஷூக்கு கமெண்ட் பண்ணுங்க. இந்த ஷூவோட லிங்க் உங்க டிஎம்க்கு நான் சென்ட் பண்றேன்.
So, what if I told you that the entire idea of the East, the Orient, as this mysterious, exotic place, isn't actually real? What if it was just an invention of the West? Let's get into this really powerful idea, which comes from the work of Edward Said. And that's really the big question we're tackling here. Is the Orient a genuine, geographical, cultural reality? Or is it a story that the West has been telling itself and the world for centuries? Well, according to Said, the answer is probably not what you think. Right. Let's just jump straight into the core claim, because it's a big one. The very idea of the Orient, as we know it, was basically constructed piece by piece by Western thinkers, artists, and politicians. This is the heart of Said's argument. He says that the Orient isn't some objective fact out there in the world. Instead, it's an idea, a concept that was created through Western books, paintings, academic papers, you name it. It was, in a way, a tool for the West to define itself by creating this massive other. And this is a really important distinction to make. Said wasn't trying to say, hey, everyone in the West, your idea of the East is wrong. Let me tell you what it's really like. That wasn't his goal at all. He wanted to pull back the curtain on the whole system and show that this language used to describe the Orient was never neutral. It was always tied to power and control. So who was the person who came up with this game-changing theory? It helps to know a little bit about the man himself, Edward Said. Edward Said was, a giant of 20th century thought. He was a brilliant literary critic, but he was also a Palestinian who grew up under British rule and later taught in the United States. And that experience gave him this incredibly unique insider-outsider perspective on the whole relationship between the West and the Middle East. You can see that his work was really driven by these 3 big missions that were all connected. He believed intellectuals had a duty to critique culture. He wanted to dissect exactly how the West talked about the East, and on a deeply personal level, he wanted to bring clarity to the Palestinian experience. So for him, the academic and the personal were completely intertwined. Okay, so with that background on the man, let's really define the key term here. What in the world is Orientalism? Put simply, Orientalism is this enormous collection of stuff, from academic studies and government reports to novels and paintings, that the West produced to define and, in a way, create its own version of the Orient. I love this phrase he used. He called it a corporate institution. That tells you everything. He's saying this wasn't just a few random, biased ideas floating around. No, it was a structured, organized, and powerful system for creating and managing knowledge about the East. And this institution had three basic jobs. First, it was a way for the West to try and make sense of this huge, different part of the world. Second, it set up Westerners as the experts, giving them the authority to say what the Orient was all about. And third, and this is the kicker, that so-called knowledge was then used to justify and make it easier to colonize and rule over those places. So here's the bottom line. Orientalism was never about innocent cultural curiosity. According to Said, it was from the very beginning a system built on a totally unequal power dynamic, where the West had all the control, the hegemony, over the East. Okay, I get that this might still feel a little abstract, so let's look at the actual patterns, the specific stereotypes that this whole system churned out again and again and again. And what's wild is how consistent this was. Said's research was massive, and he traced these same tired ideas and images all the way from ancient Greek plays, thousands of years ago, right up to scholarship being written in the 20th century. It was an incredibly durable pattern. So here's a classic one. For centuries in the West, a very common way to think about Islam wasn't as a major world religion in its own right, but as a kind of broken or even heretical copy of Christianity. Then there's another really powerful and frankly damaging stereotype. The image of the Oriental woman as this exotic, hypersexual, but also passive being. You see this trope everywhere in Western art and books, and it basically turns real, complex people into a male fantasy. And a third big one was this idea that the Orient, and especially Islamic culture, was just stuck. You know, maybe it had a glorious past, but it was seen as fundamentally unable to progress or innovate on its own, at least not without help from the West. So you might be thinking, okay, that's all interesting history, but why are we talking about a book from 1978? Well, let's get into why Orientalism is still so incredibly relevant today. Said definitely didn't see this as some old problem that just went away. He argued that modern media, our fast-paced digital world, has actually supercharged the spread of these same old dehumanizing stereotypes, especially when it comes to portrayals of Arabs and Muslims. And for him, as a Palestinian, this wasn't just some abstract academic theory. He felt very personally that the ongoing political realities of the Arab-Israeli conflict made these warped depictions even more intense and harmful. So we'll leave it with this thought. Edward Said gave us a whole new lens for seeing how a language about another culture can be created, not just to understand it, but to control it. And the question that leaves for us is, where else do we see this happening? How do these kinds of constructed stories continue to shape our perceptions, our politics, and our world right now?
अक्सर लोग सोचते हैं कि इंपोर्ट एक्सपोर्ट का बिजनेस सिर्फ बड़े लोगों के बस की बात है, लेकिन सच ये है कि अगर आप 25 रुपए में माल चाइना से ले आएं और
So, empires rise and fall, right? But what do they actually leave behind? Well, today we're going to explore a really powerful set of ideas that argue, the ghosts of empire, they're still walking among us. They're shaping everything from our politics to the stories we tell. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, just try to picture this for a second. An empire so huge, it controlled over 1/5 of all the land on the entire planet. That was the British Empire at its peak. But here's the thing. Its real influence, it wasn't just about lines on a map. It was like this invisible empire, one built in our minds and in our cultures. And honestly, it's a complex legacy we're still trying to figure out today. So how do these empires change not just the world, but the way we actually think? Well, that question, that's the absolute core of a field of study called post-colonial criticism. The best way to think about it is like a special lens, one that helps us see how the colonial past isn't really past at all. It's still alive and kicking in our present. All right, so to really get the response, first we've got to understand the wound itself, and that means digging into the massive scale of modern imperialism. So, historians basically see modern imperialism happening in three big waves, or three acts, if you will. The first one kicks off way back in 1492 with early European colonization. Then you get to the mid-19th century, and boom, it just explodes into this mad scramble for power. And finally, after World War II, the game totally changes. It's less about direct control and more about a new kind of struggle for global influence. So what was driving all this expansion? Well, it was this really complex, kind of toxic mix. I mean, of course you had the obvious stuff, economic greed, strategic power, but what's really fascinating and kind of disturbing is how they justified it all. They used these warped ideas like social Darwinism, this belief that nations were in a natural struggle for survival, and they wrapped it all up in this so-called moral justification, the incredibly arrogant idea that they were bringing a superior civilization to everyone else. And this quote, wow, this just perfectly captures the cultural mindset of the empire. A British historian named Thomas Macaulay actually said this, arguing that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. I mean, the sheer confidence. But here's the kicker. He later admitted he didn't know a single word of either Sanskrit or Arabic. Just incredible. But of course, empires don't last forever. And the 20th century saw this historic shift. A world fighting back. This was the reckoning. So, after World War II, the old imperial powers were just weakened. They were crumbling. And this created a massive power vacuum. A literal firestorm of change swept the globe. You see India gaining independence in 47, and that was like a huge spark that lit the fuse for movements everywhere. But this wasn't just about politics, you know? It was also a battle of ideas being fought in landmark books and major international conferences. And it was right here, out of this history of colonization and this massive fight for freedom, that a totally new way of thinking was born. A new critical lens. And that's what post-colonial criticism is, formally. It's a school of thought that's all about the effects of imperialism. Economic, political, cultural, you name it. Its whole goal is to flip the script, to analyze history and culture not from the top down, but from the perspective of the people who were colonized. Okay, and this is so important to get. This isn't just some passive academic thing. Post-colonial criticism has clear, active goals. It's about re-examining history from the perspective of the colonized. It's about analyzing the deep cultural and psychological impacts. And it's even about participating in the real-world goals of political and cultural liberation. So, of course, this field was shaped by several key thinkers. These were the people who gave us the big ideas, the essential tools for this kind of analysis. You have people like Frantz Fanon, who analyzed the intense psychological effects of colonization. Then there's Edward Said, who came up with this game-changing idea of Orientalism, showing how the West basically constructed this biased, often fantastical image of the East. Gayatri Spivak asked this really powerful question, can the subaltern speak? Basically, can the most marginalized people ever truly have their own voice heard? And Homi Bhabha explored hybridity, this idea of being in between two cultures, which really challenges any idea of a pure identity. And this all illustrates why these ideas still matter so much today. This isn't just academic theory, it's about decolonizing the mind. It challenges some of our most basic assumptions about culture, knowledge, and power. Okay, take the literary canon, for example. You know, the list of books we're all told are the greats, usually a straight line from Homer to someone like T.S. Eliot. Well, post-colonial critics look at that and ask a really simple but powerful question. Whose voices are missing here? Whose stories got labeled as unimportant? And it goes even deeper, right down to the words themselves. The language you speak can be a battleground. For a brilliant author like Chinua Achebe, it was a real dilemma. Do you write in English, the colonizer's language, to reach a huge global audience, or do you write in your indigenous language to express a more authentic cultural experience? It's a tough choice. The Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o took this idea even further. I mean, he actually wrote a famous essay called On the Abolition of the English Department. He argued for this really radical shift in education, wanting to center African languages and literatures, all laid out in his book, Decolonizing the Mind. So, what does this all mean for us? Well, it leaves us with a final, really powerful question. Post-colonial criticism isn't just some dusty academic theory. It's really an invitation for all of us to think critically about what stories have shaped our own world, and maybe most importantly, to ask, who gets to tell them?
Smart and O signals with auto-drawn charts. Open free DMAT account now.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Let's be honest. इन्वेस्टिंग शुरू करना कॉम्प्लिकेटेड लग सकता है. कोई कहता है स्टॉक्स, कोई म्यूचुअल फंड्स. जितने ऑप्शंस उतना कंफ्यूजन. ऊपर से कहाँ इन्वेस्ट करना है वो स्ट्रेस अलग. तो एक ऐसा ऐप होना जरूरी है जो आपकी इन्वेस्टिंग जर्नी को सिंप्लीफाई कर दे. That's why I use Grow. यहाँ पे स्टॉक्स, म्यूचुअल फंड्स, FNO और IPOs सब मिलता है with all the necessary information. And you also get a free demat account with 0 annual maintenance charges. So download Grow.
You know that feeling when a story just gets you? Like it was written specifically for you and it totally changes the way you see things? Well, what if I told you that's not just a feeling? Today, we're going to dive into this wild idea that you don't just read a story, you actually help bring it to life. So let's start with a really basic question. Is a book just, words on a page, a finished thing that just sits there waiting for us? Well, a philosopher named Wolfgang Iser would say, no way. He thought something way more exciting was going on. So here's how we're going to break down his whole theory. First, we'll look at a story's two poles. Then we'll see how you become a co-creator. After that, we'll meet this kind of mysterious character called the implied reader. We'll look at what reading actually is, and then we'll see why this whole idea might just change how you look at stories forever. All right, first up, a story's two poles. This is the absolute foundation for everything else we're going to talk about. It's all about where the author's work stops and where your work begins. So, Iser said that every story has two sides. On one hand, you've got the artistic pole. Think of this like the author's blueprint. It's the words on the page, the plot, the characters they wrote down. But then, there's the aesthetic pole. And this side, this is all you. It's your experience, your emotions, the meaning you draw from it. And here is the absolute key. The real story isn't just the text, and it's not just what's happening in your head either. Iser believed the real magic happens right in the middle. The actual literary work only sparks into existence when the author's words meet your imagination. And that leads us to this next big idea. Because if the story lives in that middle space, it means you're not just a passive audience member. Not at all. You're actually a builder. You're a co-creator. So how does that work? Well, it brings us to this really cool concept Iser called gaps. See, he argued that no story can ever tell you everything. Authors, on purpose, leave things out. Details, what a character is thinking, what happens after the last page. But these aren't plot holes. They are invitations for you to step in, to connect the dots and fill in those spaces with your own imagination. And this really gets to the heart of it. Reading isn't passive consumption. It is an active, dynamic, creative process. It is you, the reader, who takes those static words on the page and brings them to life, letting the whole thing unfold. Okay, so if the text is designed with these gaps that you're supposed to fill, who does the author think is doing all that work? Well, this leads us to Iser's most famous and maybe most mind-bending idea, the implied reader. Okay, stick with me because this one's a biggie. The implied reader is not a real person. It's not you, it's not me. Think of it more like a role that the book asks you to play. It's a set of instructions and expectations woven right into the fabric of the story, kind of like a ghost in the machine that's guiding you on how to make sense of it all. So, let's just make this super clear. 1, it is not a real person. 2, it exists only within the structure of the text itself. And 3, it is the part you are invited to perform. So for example, to really enjoy a Sherlock Holmes story, you have to adopt the role of a detective, right? You have to be looking for clues and trying to solve the puzzle, because that's the role the book needs you to play. So we have the two poles, we have the gaps, and we know about this role we're being asked to play. So how does this all come together when we're, just reading? It turns out it's this incredible moment of convergence. The actual meaning of a story doesn't live in any single one of these places. Instead, it's generated when all these different viewpoints crash into each other inside your mind. What the narrator is telling you, what the characters are going through, how the plot twists and turns, and that role of the implied reader you're playing. The meaning? It happens right there, in that beautiful, messy intersection. And Iser said this creates this really interesting tension inside of us. It's this constant pull between your actual self with all your own experiences and beliefs and the self that the book is asking you to become to understand it. And navigating that tension, that's how we make sense of it all. So what's the big takeaway here? Why does this change how we should look at every story we ever come across, whether it's a book, a movie, or even a video game?
Well, it really boils down to this. Reading isn't just consuming something, it's an act of creation. A story isn't some static object on a shelf, it's a dynamic event that only happens when you show up. And maybe most importantly, it means that you, with your specific mind and your unique imagination, are an absolutely essential part of the art itself. The story is literally incomplete without you. So the next time you get totally lost in a story, just ask yourself, what gaps am I filling in right now? What part am I playing? Who is this story asking me to be? Because that answer, that might just be the most interesting part of the entire story.
यूपीआई पेमेंट फेल हो गया था, इसे वॉलेट लेने घर आना पड़ा। अकाउंट में बैलेंस नहीं था, दोस्त कह रहा था स्लाइस यूपीआई क्रेडिट कार्ड यूज किया करो, नहीं सुना। सेम यूपीआई जैसे स्कैन करना होता है, बस पैसे आपके अकाउंट से नहीं क्रेडिट कार्ड से कटते हैं। बस नॉर्मल यूपीआई की तरह स्कैन करो, पे करो और बाद में रीपे करो। नो ज्वाइनिंग फी, नो एनुअल फी, नो हिडन चार्ज। ऊपर से हर ट्रांजैक्शन पे अप टू 3% तक का कैशबैक। दोस्त का सुन लेना चाहिए। तो जहाँ भी यूपीआई चलाते हो वहाँ पे स्लाइस चलाओ।
Today, we're digging into a question that might just change the way you think about every story you've ever loved. So let's get right into it. This is a huge debate. Is a story's meaning something the author just kind of locks away in the text for us to find? Or does that meaning only spark into existence the moment a reader, you, shows up? This whole puzzle is the driving force behind a really fascinating concept called reader response theory. Now, to really get why this idea was such a big deal, we have to look at what it was arguing against. Because for a really long time, the reader was, well, basically invisible. For a while, the main school of thought was something called formalism, and it pretty much saw a book as this perfect sealed object. The reader's only job was to figure out the right combination, crack it open, and find the one correct meaning the author put inside. Your own thoughts, your feelings, your life experiences, totally irrelevant. In fact, they were seen as a distraction from finding the real meaning. And this, right here, shows the massive shift in thinking. Formalism says a text is a static object, but reader response theory comes along and says, nope, a text is a dynamic event. Meaning isn't some treasure you have to dig up. It's an experience that happens in that magical space between the text and your imagination. But here's the interesting part. This idea didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was actually bringing back a super old way of thinking that had just been kind of pushed to the side for a while. I mean, if you look way back, the audience was always part of the conversation. The ancient Greeks wrote literature as rhetoric. It was made to persuade, to move an audience. Then you have the Romantics, who were all about the powerful emotional punch a piece of art could have on someone. Even much later, critics using frameworks like Marxism or Feminism were analyzing how texts were built to influence specific kinds of audiences. All of these were like little breadcrumbs leading back to the reader. The real game changer, though, started in the 1960s, thanks to a critic who gave us a whole new set of tools to talk about all this. Wayne Booth's book, The Rhetoric of Fiction, was a landmark. He wasn't just saying, hey, the reader's important. He was actually creating a language to analyze how the author and reader work together to create meaning. So first, he gave us this idea of the implied author. This isn't the real-life person tapping away at a keyboard. It's the version of the author we build in our heads based on the story's tone, style, and values. It's that second self that feels like it's guiding us through the narrative. And on the flip side, you have the postulated reader. This is the perfect audience the book seems to be imagining for itself. The text kind of nudges you, the real reader, to step into that role, to be someone who gets the inside jokes and understands the world the author's building. And maybe his most famous idea, one I'm sure you've heard of, is the unreliable narrator. This is where the reader's power becomes so obvious. The moment we realize, wait a minute, I can't trust this person telling the story, we have to become detectives. We have to actively question everything and build our own version of the truth. You see, the reader is doing some serious work here. Okay, let's jump ahead to the 1970s, because this is where all these separate ideas finally get pulled together into one cohesive theory. This is the moment it all clicked. At the University of Constance in Germany, a group that came to be known as the Constance School took all these different threads and wove them together. They called it reception theory, which is really just a formal way of studying how a work is received and understood by its readers. One of the big thinkers here was Wolfgang Iser. And his main idea was that no story ever tells you everything. It's full of gaps. Things left unsaid, scenes left to the imagination. And he said it's our job as readers to actively fill in those gaps. By doing that, we basically become co-creators of the story. Then there was Hans Robert Jauss. He zoomed out a little bit. He argued that a book's meaning isn't fixed. It actually changes over time. He believed a book's true history isn't just about when it was written, but about the whole history of how different generations of readers have read and responded to it. As Jauss himself said, the way a book is received by its readers is absolutely central to its significance. A classic isn't a classic just because the author was a genius. It's a classic because it keeps having this vibrant, ongoing conversation with readers, decade after decade. And this idea was catching on everywhere. Over in the US, a critic named Stanley Fish took things even further. He basically argued that meaning isn't really in the book or even in the individual reader. Instead, he said it's created by the interpretive communities we're a part of. Just think about it. A dedicated fan group for a sci-fi show will read an episode very differently than someone who's never seen it, right? That's because they share this whole universe of assumptions and inside knowledge. So, okay, we've gone through a lot of theory. But what does any of this actually mean for you the next time you sit down with a good book or watch a movie? Honestly, this is the best analogy I've ever heard for this. A text is like a musical score. All the notes are there, printed in black and white on the page, but on its own, it's silent. It doesn't become music, it doesn't become a story until a musician, the reader, shows up to perform it, bringing their own rhythm, emotion, and style to the piece. The big takeaway here is just so empowering. It means that there isn't one right way to read something. Your own background, your experiences, your perspective, they're not distractions, they're essential parts of the process. Meaning isn't something you passively find, it's something you actively help create. Reading isn't just consumption, it's an act of creation. So yeah, the author may have written the last sentence, but the story is never really over. It's just waiting for its co-author. It's waiting for you. So the next time you open a book, just remember, the author started the story, but you're the one who brings it to life. The question is, what story are you going to create? All right, today we are diving into one of the most mind-bending and honestly most important ideas in modern philosophy. We're going to completely rethink the idea of power, all through the eyes of the one and only Michel Foucault. So let me just ask you this. When you hear that word, power, what's the first image that pops into your head? Because for most of us, it's probably something big, something top-down. You know, maybe you picture this. The monarch, a king, sitting on a massive, gleaming throne. All power flows from this one single point, this one person who has absolute authority. Or hey, maybe you think of the modern version, the state. You see it in the cold, imposing architecture of a courthouse, or you hear it in the final, decisive crack of a judge's gavel. Power as this giant system of laws that tells us what to do. And in our world, of course, you might picture this, a hyper-modern, sterile boardroom. The power of the corporation, held by a CEO, shaping not just a company, but our entire lives. Again, it's power coming from the top. So we've got the king, the judge, the CEO. But what if I told you that by focusing on these figures, we're missing the point entirely? The French philosopher Michel Foucault would say, we're not just getting the answer wrong, we're asking the completely wrong question. So who was this guy who wanted to turn our whole understanding of power on its head? Well, Michel Foucault was a French philosopher who spent his entire life on one massive project, trying to figure out how modern society creates and controls people. And the thing is, he wasn't just some abstract thinker in an armchair. No, he was more like an archaeologist of ideas. He literally went into the archives, digging through the history of real places, hospitals, asylums, prisons, to see how control actually works on the ground. Okay, let's get into the heart of it, because this is where Foucault really changes the game. He tells us stop asking who has power and start asking how power works. It's a total shift in perspective. Just look at this breakdown. The traditional view, on the left, sees power as a solid pyramid. It's a thing, right? Like a crown or a scepter that you can possess. But Foucault's view, on the right, it's more like a pulsating network. It's not something you have. It's something that happens. It's a dynamic, flowing relationship that moves through every single part of society. Let's just sit with that quote for a second. Power comes from everywhere. What he's saying is there's no single headquarters, no central source. Power is the overall effect that pops up from thousands, even millions, of tiny everyday interactions. So this is the key. When Foucault talks about power, he doesn't just mean the government. He means this incredibly complicated, ever-shifting web of relationships. It's the dynamic between a doctor and a patient, a teacher and a student, a boss and an employee, even between you and your friends. Okay, so if power isn't just a king barking orders, how does this network actually function? How does it shape us? Foucault's absolutely brilliant answer is this: it works through knowledge. Think about it. When it feels like psychology defines what normal behavior is, that's not a neutral scientific fact. It's an act of power that creates a standard we all feel pressured to live up to. Foucault called this power knowledge because for him, you can't separate them. The act of creating categories, of defining what's true, is maybe the most subtle and most effective form of control there is. So where does this power knowledge really get its grip? Well, Foucault says it's not in the spooky old dungeons. It's in the clean, modern, efficient places that we're in every single day. The school, the hospital, the factory, the office. See, modern power is sneaky. It doesn't need an executioner's axe. It works through technique, through exams, deadlines, and performance reviews. It works through normalization. It makes us want to be a good student or a productive worker. Its goal isn't just to punish us when we step out of line. Its goal is to control and shape us into predictable, manageable people from the very start. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This all sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it? Like we're all just trapped in this invisible web. But Foucault was incredibly clear on this next point. If power is everywhere, then guess what? So is resistance. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. Resistance isn't some outside force that attacks the system. No, it sprouts up from within the power network itself. It's born right at the point where power is being used. It's the patient who questions the doctor's diagnosis. It's the worker who finds a way to slow down the assembly line. So you can forget the idea of a single great refusal or one lone hero who's going to save everybody. Foucault sees a whole landscape of resistance. It's made up of countless small, specific, local acts of pushback. And he suggests that real big change, what we might call a revolution, is really just what happens when all of these tiny points of resistance manage to link up and become a strategy. So, we want to leave you with this final thought. Foucault's ideas aren't just for a textbook. They're a map for our own lives. He gives us a lens to see the subtle ways power and knowledge are shaping us every single day. So the question isn't just about kings and governments anymore. The real question is, now that you see the network, where are you within it?
Excuse me, quick question. आप अपने शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स जैसे?
शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स जैसे कि वेकेशन हो गया, कोई नया फोन लेना हो गया या फिर किसी के लिए कोई बड़ा गिफ्ट लेना।
ओ अच्छा ऐसे। ट्रिप्स तो मैं बहुत लेती हूँ, साल में एटलीस्ट 4 बार।
आप उन ट्रिप्स के लिए पैसा कैसे सेव करते हो?
एवरी मंथ मेरी सैलरी अकाउंट में हिट होते ही मैं एक पार्ट आरडी में इन्वेस्ट कर देती हूँ।
आरडी मतलब?
रिकरिंग डिपॉजिट्स। जैसे म्यूचुअल फंड्स के दुनिया में एसआईपी होता है, वैसे ही एफडी की दुनिया में आरडी होता है। एवरी मंथ सैलरी का एक पार्ट उसमें इन्वेस्ट हो जाता है और ट्रैवल के लिए भी सेविंग्स हो जाती है।
और ये आरडी आपने कहाँ से करवाई?
स्टेबल मनी ऐप से। यहाँ 7 से 8% तक की हाई इंटरेस्ट वाली सारी आरडीज मिल जाती है, जहाँ पे आप अमाउंट भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो, ड्यूरेशन भी खुद सिलेक्ट कर सकते हो और यूपीआई सेटअप भी कर सकते हो। कभी स्टॉप करनी है तो स्टॉप भी कर सकते हो और पैसे विड्रॉल भी कर सकते हो। तो अब आप भी अपनी नेक्स्ट वेकेशन के लिए आरडी सेटअप करो ओनली ऑन स्टेबल मनी ऐप।
Your wardrobe refreshes with trending styles faster than I can refresh my feed. But कैसे?
With freshly found on Myntra. See, for everything you heart online, you can just add the cart on Myntra.
Ooh, one app with everything trending?
Yep.
I love it. Can I double tap it?
Of course.
So have you ever wondered if you can really, truly get a story without understanding the world it came from? Today, we're diving into this really powerful idea that says you can't. It's called New Historicism, and it's basically a lens that shows us how every single work of art is tangled up in the time it was made. I mean, think about it for a second. We can all read a Shakespeare play today, right? But are we really seeing what his audience saw? Can we feel the same political tensions or hear the religious debates that were buzzing in the air all around him? This is the central puzzle that historicism has been trying to solve for centuries. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with that big, timeless question. Then we'll look at the first answer, which is just plain old historicism, and see where it kind of hits a wall. That's going to lead us straight to what makes new historicism so different, and then we'll see it all in action with Shakespeare himself. Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the original idea, historicism. This was really the first big systematic attempt to connect a work of art back to the specific moment it was created. And the core idea, it's simple, but it's a game changer. Context is everything. You just can't analyze a 16th century play using 21st century ideas. The thinking goes that every piece of art is, and I quote, determined by its specific historical circumstances. It's a product of its time, period. And you know, this wasn't just some fleeting thought. This idea has a long, serious history. It kicked off with German writers way back in the 18th century and was then built upon by major historians and philosophers for the next 200 years. This is a deep intellectual tradition we're talking about. But, and this is a big but, this whole approach ran into a massive philosophical problem. If every text is a product of its time, well, what about us? What about the historian? Aren't we, as the interpreters, also trapped in our time? And that's the real dilemma, isn't it? We all have a modern worldview. Our beliefs, our science, our politics, everything. How on earth can we shed all of that to see the past with totally objective eyes? Is it even possible to escape our own point of view? Well, some smart people came up with a pretty clever workaround. They said, okay, let's just split it in two. There's the original, meaning, what the author actually intended to say. And then there's the significance, what it means to us today with all our modern baggage. It's a neat way to try and keep that idea of an objective, knowable history alive. But here's the kicker. What if that whole idea is just wrong? What if there isn't one single original meaning buried in the text, just waiting for us to dig it up like some kind of treasure? What if meaning is way messier and more alive than that? This very question is the door that new historicism just blew right off its hinges. And that, my friends, brings us to the 1980s and a really radical shift in thinking. A whole new way of looking at the relationship between art and history started to take shape, and it changed everything. So, the term New Historicism itself was coined by a scholar named Stephen Greenblatt. But a lot of the big ideas behind it came from the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault's huge insight was that power isn't just something a king has that flows down to his subjects. No, he said power is everywhere. It circulates through everything in a society. Every law, every book, every conversation. So here's what this new approach looks like in a nutshell. First, forget about history with a capital H as this one single set of facts. New historicists see it as just another text, another interpretation. They take literature off its fancy pedestal and throw it right into the middle of a messy cultural mosh pit, arguing with everything from political pamphlets to medical journals. For them, culture isn't one unified thing. It's this tangled web of competing ideas, all caught up in that circulation of power. All right, so this isn't just some abstract theory for academics. Let's get practical and see how it actually works, because it completely revolutionized the way we read someone like Shakespeare. For centuries, the way we talked about Shakespeare was as this timeless, universal genius, a writer for all people in all places. Well, new historicism came along and said, hold on a minute. It argued that Shakespeare wasn't some guy floating above his world. He was knee-deep in it, actively participating in the biggest fights of his day. And this way of thinking just unleashed this wave of incredible new studies. All of a sudden, critics weren't just admiring the poetry, they were digging into the plays for clues about colonialism, for challenges to royal authority, for shifting ideas about gender and sexuality. They started to see the plays as battlegrounds for the big ideas of the Elizabethan era. And this gets us to the most crucial point of all. For a new historicist, literature isn't just a passive mirror that reflects what was happening in history. No way. It's an active player. A play or a novel can either prop up the dominant powers of its time, or it can challenge them. It's part of the engine that actually creates culture. So that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. If history isn't a fixed thing, but a story that we're all constantly rewriting, and if our art is part of the ink we use to write it, then you have to ask yourself, what story are our movies, our music, and our books writing about us right now?
What are future historians going to see when they look back and read the story of our time? You know, what if gender isn't something you are, but something you do every single day? That's the wild and provocative idea at the heart of philosopher Judith Butler's work, and today we're going to unpack it. Yeah, let's just dive right in with that. Is your gender an innate quality, something that's just always been a part of who you are? Or is it something that gets built, action by action, word by word, over time? How you answer this is really the key that unlocks everything we're talking about today. And that's exactly the question Judith Butler takes on in this hugely influential book, Gender Trouble. It's considered a foundational text for a reason. It fundamentally challenges the basic assumptions so many of us have about what gender even is and where it comes from. Okay, so to really get what Butler is saying, we've got to first understand the idea she was arguing against. For centuries, Western thought has kind of treated the human body as this blank page, a neutral object that exists before culture comes along and leaves its mark. And you can really see just how consistent this idea has been. I mean, you look at early Christianity, and the body was seen as this flawed vessel. Then you get Descartes, who famously split the thinking mind from the physical body. Even much later, thinkers who talked about culture writing on the body, they all started from the same place. The body is this neutral thing first, and then culture comes along and gives it meaning. This quote just captures that old school view perfectly. The body is passive, a blank page, just sitting there waiting for society to write all its rules and meanings onto it. It's a simple, powerful metaphor, and it's the exact idea Butler sets out to dismantle. And this is where Butler just flips the whole thing on its head. She argues that we can't even talk about a natural body without using cultural language. So for her, culture doesn't just write on the body, it basically creates the body as we understand it, defining its boundaries and its meaning right from the very start. All right, so if the body isn't a blank page, then what is it? And where does gender fit into all of this? Well, that leads us right to Butler's most famous, most groundbreaking idea, the concept of gender as a performance. Okay, let's really unpack this, because this concept is, it's everything. The key word here is performativity. What it means is that your gender isn't some deep internal essence you have, but it's something you do over and over and over. It's constructed from all the repeated actions, gestures, and ways of talking that our culture has stamped as masculine or feminine. And this, right here, is probably the most radical piece of the whole argument. Butler is essentially saying there's no original, real gender identity hiding inside of you. Instead, that feeling of having an internal identity, that's the result. It's the effect generated by constantly repeating all those external acts. Okay, so you might be thinking, hang on, if that's true, then why does my gender feel so real, so personal and natural? Well, for Butler, the answer is all about the incredible power of repetition. And this process here really illustrates how it works. It all starts with one small thing, a gesture, the way you walk, the clothes you wear. Then that gesture gets repeated, not just by you, but by everyone around you in society. Over time, all that repetition makes the act seem totally normal, until it creates this powerful illusion of a natural internal gender. It's like the performance ends up creating the performer. Now, this is a super important point to get right. When Butler says performance, she's not talking about an actor on a stage who gets to wake up and choose their role for the day. It's actually the opposite. We're sort of compelled to follow these cultural scripts that already exist because, we get rewarded when we conform and we're often punished when we don't. So it's a practice we're pushed into, not some free choice. So what's the big deal? Why does all this matter? Well, this isn't just some abstract philosophical idea. Understanding gender as a performance actually opens up brand new possibilities and has real-world consequences for power and for identity. And Butler's really clear on this. These gender scripts aren't neutral at all. They're enforced by these big social power structures that prefer certain performances, like traditional masculinity and heterosexuality. And they tend to penalize anything that falls outside those narrow boxes. These frames of power are actively restricting which kinds of identities are seen as okay, as legitimate. And this is the really hopeful, almost revolutionary spark in her work. If gender is just a collection of repeated acts, if it's not some fixed biological fact, then that means those acts can be changed. The performance itself can be different. And this, really, is the ultimate takeaway. When people perform gender differently, when they challenge the scripts, break the norms, and create new ways of being, they're not just expressing a different personal choice.
According to this theory, they are actively reshaping and expanding the very definition of what gender can even mean. So we'll leave you with this question to think about. Butler's work really asks us to look at our own lives, to look at the world around us, not as a set of fixed rules, but maybe more like a stage that's just full of possibilities. So what scripts are we all following without even thinking about it? And more importantly, which ones are ready to be rewritten? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. All right, today we're diving into the work of a thinker who truly rewired how we look at culture, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. She challenged us all to see that the things we take for granted about gender and desire, well, they're actually the hidden engines that make our world run. Let's get into how she did it. So let's start with this one quote, because it's huge. Sedgwick argued that this drama of gender difference isn't just some side story. Nope. She said it's the fundamental script that organizes all of human culture. That's a pretty big claim, right? So what was she really getting at? So, who was this person with these incredible ideas? Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick wasn't just an academic. You could almost call her an intellectual architect. She looked at the blueprints of our society and our literature and basically said, wait a minute, these plans are missing entire rooms. And then she started drawing up completely new ones. And her work just exploded across these three major fields. I mean, she wasn't just another voice. In many ways, she provided the essential language, the very tools that helped build the foundations of what we now call queer theory. It's like she handed everyone a new pair of glasses to see things that were right in front of them the whole time, but were completely invisible before. Okay, so let's get back to that core idea, this drama of gender. For Sedgwick, this wasn't just about men and women. This was the main stage, the absolute center, where the biggest questions about power and culture were always being played out. And here is the big shift she made. You know, for centuries, gender and sexuality were kind of treated like footnotes. Interesting side topics, sure, but separate from the real story of politics or economics. Sedgwick just flipped that script completely. She argued you can't possibly understand a novel or a law or even a historical event until you understand the hidden currents of gender and desire that are shaping it from the inside out. And her theory didn't just stop with gender. She showed how it's all part of this massive, tangled web. You can't talk about gender without also talking about the core pillars of our society: power, race, and class. If you pull on one of those threads, all the others move with it. They're inseparable. So how do all these threads of power and gender actually connect? To see that, we really need to understand one of her most famous analytical tools. It's a concept that revolves around one key term she brought into the spotlight: homosociality. What on earth is that? Well, it sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Homosocial just describes the social ties between people of the same sex. So think friendships, mentorships, rivalries, everything from a sports team's locker room to a corporate boardroom. It seems basic, but this is where Sedgwick's analysis gets really, really interesting. In her groundbreaking book, Between Men, she gives this really clear definition. But the genius here wasn't just in defining the word, it was in how she used it, almost like a magnifying glass, to look at the hidden mechanics of power, especially between men. And this is maybe her most powerful application of the whole idea. Sedgwick started noticing this pattern over and over again, especially in literature. The most intense bonds between two men were often formed through a woman. So you might have two men who are rivals for a woman's love, right? But that rivalry itself creates this incredibly powerful charged connection between them. She famously called this the erotic triangle. The woman becomes a kind of conduit for all the social and psychological energy that's really flowing between the men. It's a structure that often ends up reinforcing male power, because the woman is made into an object, not the one driving the action. So by uncovering hidden structures like that, Sedgwick was already showing us that relationships are way more complex than we think. And that led her directly to her next major contribution, a radical takedown of the very idea of fixed identities. This chart really lays it out perfectly. We're so used to thinking about identity in these rigid boxes. You're either this or you're that. Clear lines. But Sedgwick saw it more like currents in a river, fluid, always changing depending on the context, on the landscape around them. For her, an identity isn't some permanent state you're in. It's more of a temporary position you occupy. And here's the real kicker from that idea. If identity is fluid, it means our whole definition of what counts as sexual isn't some timeless universal fact. It's a cultural artifact. What one society in one moment considers normal or deviant, well, that's not a universal truth. It's just one frame in a very, very long movie.
So, after taking apart these huge, fundamental structures of culture and identity, what is Sedgwick's lasting legacy? Why are we still talking about these ideas today? Why do they still feel so relevant? Well, her legacy is immense. By insisting that gender was central, she gave us a whole new map for understanding culture. She showed us that the lines we thought were drawn in permanent ink were really just drawn in sand. She revealed all those hidden pathways connecting our private desires to the huge public structures of power, race, and class. And, maybe most importantly for academia, she was a great synthesizer. She showed how different ways of thinking, like Marxism and feminism, weren't necessarily competing, but were both essential tools for building a more complete, more honest picture of our world. In the end, Sedgwick's work isn't just an analysis of the past. It's really a profound challenge for our future. It leaves us with this huge question. If the lines that we use to define ourselves, our genders, our desires, our very sense of who we are, if those lines aren't set in stone but are fluid and always in motion, then what does that free us up to do? What kind of world are we actually free to imagine and create? Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into the work of Gayle Rubin, a feminist anthropologist who completely changed the conversation around sex. She asked a really radical question. What if our rules about sex aren't really about morality at all, but about power? I mean, think about it. Why are societies all over the world so obsessed with policing sexuality? We're often taught that these rules are just natural or that they're for our own good. But Rubin suggested we look deeper. What if there's a different story to tell? And this is where Gayle Rubin enters the picture. Back in the 70s and 80s, feminism was already making huge waves. But Rubin looked at the landscape and said, hang on, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle here. So let's get into what she uncovered. Okay, so to really get what Rubin did, we have to understand the world she was in. At the time, feminist theory was laser focused on one main idea: gender oppression. And look, that was an absolutely critical framework, but Rubin started to notice it had some serious blind spots. In fact, early in her career, Rubin herself helped build that framework. She came up with this idea of the sex-gender system. The whole point was to show how society takes the raw material of biological sex and shapes it, molds it into a social product, creating our gender roles, our identities, everything. It was a foundational concept. And this theory was, without a doubt, a game changer for understanding the oppression of women. But Rubin realized it had limits. It couldn't really explain why people were persecuted for their desires, for who or how they loved. The lens they were using was just too narrow. They needed a new one. And that brings us to her bombshell 1984 essay, Thinking Sex. This is where she makes a really sharp distinction, one that would completely reshape how we talk about these things for decades. Rubin basically said, look, gender and sexuality are two different things. They're related for sure, they often overlap, but they are distinct systems of oppression. So for example, a lesbian faces prejudice for being a woman, right? That's gender oppression. But she also faces prejudice for her sexual orientation. A single theory about gender just can't explain both of those things at the same time. So, if the old way of thinking was incomplete, what was her solution? Well, Rubin proposed a whole new theory of sex itself. She argued that we need to stop thinking of sexuality as just a side effect of gender and start seeing it for what it is, its own unique political battleground. And this, right here, is the heart of it. Sexuality isn't some private, personal thing that just happens behind closed doors. Oh no. It is organized by our society, it is regulated by our laws and institutions, it's a place of intense political struggle over who gets to be seen as normal, what's considered acceptable, or even who's considered fully human. And she showed that this stuff isn't timeless. Our modern sexual world didn't just pop into existence. Big historical changes like industrialization, people moving from farms to big cities, all of that created the conditions for new identities and new communities to form around shared desires. And you've got to remember, the goal here wasn't just to write a clever academic paper. For Rubin, this was deeply political. The whole point was to create a tool, a weapon even, that could be used to identify, explain, and ultimately fight back against all forms of erotic injustice. But to even begin building this new theory, she had to clear the ground first. She had to take on these really powerful, deeply ingrained ideas that actually stop us from thinking clearly about sex in the first place. Rubin argued that our thinking gets blocked by three main forces, what she called sexual essentialism, sexual negativity, and the big one, the sexual hierarchy. So let's break these down one by one.
First up is sexual essentialism. This is basically the idea that sex is just a natural biological force, something timeless and unchanging. Rubin says this is a trap. Because if we believe sex is just natural, then we become blind to the ways it's actually shaped by politics, by history, and by power. The second obstacle is sexual negativity. This is that deep-seated cultural belief that sex is, at its core, dangerous and destructive. It's a worldview that treats basically any sexual act as guilty until proven innocent, and it's used to justify all kinds of control and regulation. And that brings us to the third and maybe the most powerful obstacle she identified. It's this invisible system that society uses to sort all sexual acts into a rigid pecking order of value. Rubin calls this the sexual hierarchy. You can picture it like a pyramid. Right at the very top, you've got the good, normal stuff. Married, monogamous, heterosexual sex. Then below that, you have acts that are maybe questionable, kind of tolerated, but not really celebrated. And then way down at the bottom, you have the acts that society considers totally bad, unnatural, and deserving of punishment. So what's holding this whole thing together? It's the core belief that there's only one right way to be sexual. A single ideal standard. Every other kind of desire, every other practice is then judged based on how far away it is from that privileged norm. And that, right there, is how you create a system of erotic injustice. Now, this essay was written decades ago, but what's incredible is how relevant it still is. Rubin's framework is an essential tool for understanding the battles over sexuality that are happening all around us, right now. When you boil it all down, Gail Rubin's work was a massive paradigm shift. She gave us the language and the concepts to stop seeing sexuality as some simple biological fact and to start seeing it for what it truly is, a complex social and political system constantly being shaped by history, power, and the ongoing fight for justice. And that really leaves us with a final question to think about. Using Rubin's ideas as a lens, just look at the world around you. What's considered good sex today? What's just barely tolerated, and what is still punished? The hierarchies are still there if you know.
Welcome to the explainer. The way we talk about gender and sexuality has completely changed over the last few decades. It's been this huge shift from street protests all the way to dense academic theory. So today we're going to trace that journey. It's a really complex and fascinating one, from the Stonewall riots all the way to what we now call queer theory. All right, so first things first, what even is gender studies? It's easy to think of it as just one thing, but it's really not. It's this super broad, interdisciplinary field. It pulls from so many different areas to look at how gender gets formed and represented, the history of oppressed groups, and really importantly, how gender connects with all these other parts of our identity, like race, class, and so on. And yeah, when we say interdisciplinary, we're not kidding. Think of it like a mashup of all these different fields. You've got literary and cultural theory, sociology, anthropology, even psychoanalysis. All of them bring their own tools and perspectives to the table. It's this incredible meeting point for different ways of understanding the world. Okay, so here's the plan for our explainer. We'll start with what gender studies is. We've kind of touched on that. Then we'll jump to the Stonewall turning point. Look at the split between feminism and lesbian separatism, chart the rise of queer theory, and finally meet some of the pioneers of modern theory. Sound good? Let's go. All right, first stop, the Stonewall turning point. This is really about that shift from repression to open rebellion. So, to really get what happened at Stonewall, you have to understand the pressure that was building. After World War II, you start to see these gay communities popping up in the margins of big cities. But then comes the 1950s, and with it, this massive wave of repression and backlash. It was this constant push and pull. And then, in 1969, it all just explodes. The Stonewall riots weren't just a one-night thing. It was the sustained resistance to police harassment. It really was the spark that lit the fire for a whole new era of political solidarity and activism. And here's a really important point. This didn't just come out of nowhere. These things never do. The seeds were being planted for a long time in the world of art and culture. You had incredible writers like Oscar Wilde and James Baldwin, artists like Andy Warhol. They were already pushing boundaries and exploring these themes in their work. So this sense of a shared identity, this gay self-consciousness, was already bubbling up long before Stonewall. Okay, so this new solidarity was powerful, but it also started to create some cracks from within, which brings us to feminism and lesbian separatism, a kind of schism from inside the movement. So, this is where things get really interesting. You had mainstream feminism, which was often working with this idea of a universal female identity, right? A kind of we're all in this together as women vibe. But a lot of lesbian critics were saying, hang on a second, that doesn't really include us. They argued that this universal identity actually erased their specific experiences. Their take was that real feminism, the purest form, meant total autonomy from men. This was a huge deal because it basically blew up the idea of a single unified womanhood and forced everyone to think about identity in a much more nuanced way. And right in the middle of this debate was an absolutely brilliant poet and theorist named Adrienne Rich. In 1980, she came up with this really powerful new way of thinking about the bonds between women. She called it the lesbian continuum. And what she meant by that wasn't strictly about sexual experience. It was so much broader. It was about this whole spectrum of woman-identified experiences. Things like deep friendships, supporting each other, bonding together against male power structures. It was a complete game changer in how people thought about female relationships. And Adrienne Rich was definitely not a lone voice here. A whole intellectual movement was taking shape. You had groups like the Radical Lesbians and thinkers like Jill Johnston, Monique Wittig, Gloria Anzaldúa. They were all building this case for a distinct lesbian identity, one that stood on its own, separate from mainstream feminism, and also from the gay rights movement, which was often focused on gay men. So you can see how the ground was being prepared, right? All these intense debates about identity and who belongs where. It all created the perfect conditions for the next big thing in the 1990s, the rise of queer theory. This is where the questions got even bigger and way more radical. People started asking, what if identity itself isn't this fixed, stable thing we're born with? What if the categories we use every day, like gay or straight, man or woman, aren't actually natural or essential at all? And this line of thinking led directly to what we now call queer theory. What's so amazing about it is how it took the word queer, which had been used as a weapon, as a slur, and completely reclaimed it. The whole point of queer theory is to challenge those fixed identity boxes. It argues that our identities aren't something deep inside us, but are actually subject positions that are built by the culture and the language we live in. The big idea here is something called anti-essentialism, which sounds complicated, but it just means that our identities aren't some pre-written essence inside of us. This changed everything. The goal became to question any fixed sexual identity and to deconstruct that simple black and white distinction between hetero and homosexual. Basically, to pull it apart and show that it's not so simple. And this had real-world consequences, like shifting alliances. The focus moved from gender to sexuality, which meant some lesbian theorists felt they had more in common with gay men than with straight women. So who were the architects of this massive shift? Let's talk about some of the key pioneers of modern theory who are still shaping this debate. There are so many important thinkers that our source material really points to three absolute giants in the field. You've got Gail Rubin, who did groundbreaking work on how societies decide which sexualities are good and which are bad. Then there's Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who is just central to developing queer theory and taking apart that straight/gay binary. And of course, Judith Butler, whose idea that gender is something we do, a kind of performance, has been unbelievably influential. These three really set the terms for the debate we're still having today, which leaves us with one last big, mind-bending question to chew on. If our identities really are in flux, if they're not fixed things we're born with, but are shaped by our culture, then what does that mean for everything else? For how power works, for politics, and maybe most importantly, what does it mean for you? That's the question that sits right at the heart of gender studies, and it's one.
Unlock the power of ETF investing with Angel One. Open free demat account now.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
अगर आपको भी ये बिजनेस सीखना है तो सीखो ऐप डाउनलोड कर लो। मैं आपसे ये नहीं कह रहा हूँ कि आप आज ही जाकर ये बिजनेस शुरू कर दें, लेकिन क्या आपको इस बिजनेस के बारे में पता है? कौन सी मशीन लगती है, किसको बेचना होता है, कितना प्रॉफिट कमाया जा सकता है? अगर आपको ये सारी बातें पता ही नहीं होंगी तो आप सोचेंगे भी कैसे कि ये बिजनेस किया जा सकता है। आपको एक एप्लीकेशन डाउनलोड करनी चाहिए जिसे हम सीखो ऐप कहते हैं। सीखो एक बहुत बढ़िया ऐप है जिसमें 100 से ज्यादा बिजनेस आइडियाज को A to Z सिखाया गया है। वहाँ कोई बड़ी बड़ी बातें नहीं करता कि 1 महीने में 2 करोड़ कमा लो या 3 करोड़ कमा लो। सीखो कि टीम बिजनेस के स्टेप्स सिखाती है और ये सिखाती है कि बिजनेस करने के लिए आपको क्या क्या चीजों की जरूरत पड़ेगी ताकि आप बिजनेस करने के काबिल बन सके। जीवन भर नौकरी थोड़ी ना करनी है, कभी ना कभी तो आप सोचेंगे बिजनेस करने के बारे में, और तब तक अलग अलग बिजनेस आइडियाज तो सीखते रहें और उसके लिए डाउनलोड करें सीखो ऐप।
इंस्टॉल नाउ पे क्लिक करो और अभी सीखो ऐप डाउनलोड करो।
All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about one of the most influential and honestly revolutionary essays from the 20th century. It's Elaine Sixos's 1975 work, The Laugh of the Medusa. We're going to break down how she took this ancient symbol of pure terror and turned it into an incredible symbol of feminist liberation. But let's start with a question that really gets to the core of what Sixos was doing. It's a question designed to just flip everything you thought you knew on its head. What if the monster, the one we've all been taught to run from, was actually the hero of the story? You know this face. We all do. It's Medusa. Snake hair, terrifying gaze that turns men to stone. For centuries, she's been the ultimate monster, right? A symbol of deadly femininity, a warning, someone to be defeated. That's the story we get told over and over again. But then, in 1975, the incredible French feminist thinker Elaine Sixos comes along and says, wait a minute, it's time to actually confront this myth. She had this wild idea. What if, instead of running away from the monster, we just looked her straight in the eye? And boom, with that one sentence, Sixos just completely dismantles the old story. Suddenly, everything changes. The monster we were told was so deadly, Sixos says no, she's beautiful. And that scream we all imagine, it's not a scream at all. She's laughing. And that laugh, well, that laugh is everything. So you might be asking, why was this so important? Why did Medusa need this kind of rebranding? Well, Sixos argued that for basically all of history, society has trapped women inside this kind of ideological cage, pinning them between what she called two horrifying myths. And here's the cage. On one side, you have the Medusa, woman as this terrifying, powerful threat that needs to be punished. On the other side, you have what she calls the abyss, drawing on Freud's idea of woman as a dark continent, passive, mysterious, and really defined by what she lacks. So your choices are monster or nothing. Sixos saw this as a completely impossible trap. Okay, so if you're stuck in a prison made of ideas, how do you possibly get out? Sixos's answer was totally game-changing. She said the key, the tool for liberation, was a brand new way of writing. She gave it a name, écriture féminine, which just means feminine writing. Now, this isn't just about the author being a woman. It's about a whole new style. It throws out that rigid A to B to C logic that has dominated Western culture. Instead, it's a writing that's associative, free-flowing, a writing that comes directly from the body. And this is her famous call to arms. Write yourself. Your body must be heard. For Sixos, this was not some abstract academic theory. It was deeply, unapologetically physical. Writing becomes this act of reclaiming your own body, letting its feelings, its rhythms, its wisdom finally have a voice after being silenced for so long. But why is that so revolutionary? I mean, just writing from the body? Well, think about it. For thousands of years, so much of male-dominated philosophy and religion has taught that the body is bad, right? It's a distraction from some higher abstract truth. Sixos basically says that's a con. By writing from the body, women can bring back everything that's been repressed and reclaim their actual lived experience as a real source of truth. And that brings us right back to our laughing Medusa. So we've got it. She's not a monster, and her power is coming from this new way of expressing herself. But now we need to talk about the most important part of all, the incredible political power behind that laugh. And just look at the transformation here. The terrifying scream is gone. In its place, you see this knowing confidence. It's not terrifying anymore. She's still powerful. But now she's in control of her own story, not a victim of it. So we have to ask the big question. Why is she laughing? What's so special about this laugh? Because it's not just about being happy or finding something funny. No, it's something way more dangerous. And here's Sixos's absolutely explosive answer. Laughter is a weapon. It's a force that is designed to shatter the old world. A feminine text doesn't argue with the truth, it breaks it up with laughter. It doesn't negotiate with the law, it blows it up. So what's in the crosshairs? What is this laughter targeting? We're talking about the big stuff. The rigid structures of institutions, the law with a capital L. The idea that there's only one single masculine truth. All the social rules built on top of those things. Her laughter is revolutionary because it simply refuses to take any of it seriously anymore. And that really brings us to the ultimate point of this whole project. For Sixu, this isn't just about finding a new way to write poems or novels. It's about using that writing to actually build a different kind of world. And here she is. This is the final vision. Medusa, completely transformed. She's not a monster. She's not a victim. She is magnificent, powerful, and literally glowing with her own light. This image right here is what becomes possible when women are the ones telling their own stories. Sixos puts it perfectly. Writing is where change begins. It's that space where new subversive ideas can start to grow. It's the first move you make before you can actually transform society. You have to write the change before you can live the change. So we'll end by turning this idea back to you. Now that you've seen how a powerful myth can be taken apart and rebuilt into something new, ask yourself, what so-called truth in your own world, what rigid rule, needs to be met not with a serious argument, but with the radical, revolutionary power of...
So, have you ever stopped to think about whether the language we use every single day is, well, truly neutral? We're about to dive into a pretty radical idea from 20th century France. It's called l'écriture féminine, or feminine writing, and it basically suggests that the very words we speak might have a hidden bias. It really asks us to rethink the whole nature of language itself. Let's just jump right in with a quote from one of the movement's key thinkers, Hélène Cixous, that really gets to the heart of it. Women must write their bodies. Now that is the provocative core of this whole idea. This belief that a totally new kind of language, one that's rooted in physical experience and the unconscious, could unlock a completely new way of being in the world. And this really is the central question we're digging into today. Is the structure of our language, the grammar, the logic, is it actually neutral? Or could it be that the system we just take for granted is suddenly shaped by a single dominant point of view? And I mean, if that's true, what would it even look like to try and change it? To really get where an idea this big came from, we have to go back in time, specifically to Paris in 1968. Because this wasn't just some abstract theory cooked up in a university. Nope, this was forged in the fire of a genuine social revolution. Okay, so picture this. May 1968 in France. The streets are filled with protests. It's an atmosphere where everything feels possible, like society could be remade from the ground up. In the years that followed, intellectuals grabbed onto that revolutionary energy and turned it inward. They started arguing that to really change society, you first had to change the very tools we think with, language itself. And this thinking led right to cornerstone texts like Julia Kristeva's Revolution in Poetic Language in 1974. So, out of this intense desire to revolutionize not just what was happening in the streets, but what was happening in our minds, this powerful new concept starts to take shape. And here it is, l'écriture féminine. At its core, it's a style of writing that is deliberately trying to break free from what its supporters saw as a rigid, male-centric way of thinking. Instead of strict logic, it aims to tap into something much more fluid, more intuitive, something deeply connected to the body and the unconscious mind. And this wasn't just the idea of one person. It was a real collective intellectual project. You had thinkers like Sixos, Irigaray, and Kristeva all chipping in, each with their own unique take on how to pull off this linguistic revolution. And this is where the contrast really becomes crystal clear. On one side, you have what these thinkers called phallocentric discourse. Think of language that's all about rigid categories, strict logic, and ultimately upholding existing power structures. And on the other side, you have the goal of feminine language, to be fluid, less structured, rooted in the body, and dedicated to undermining that very power. Now, it's really important to know that this wasn't a universally accepted idea, not even among all feminists. Some thinkers, like Monique Wittig, really pushed back. They argued that focusing so heavily on the body was kind of a trap, that it risked reducing women to just their biology and wasn't actually a very effective way to create real political change in the world.
To go a bit deeper, let's zoom in on probably the most complex and influential theorist of the group, Julia Kristeva. Her work gives us this incredible framework for understanding exactly how language could be revolutionary. Her book from 1974, Revolution in Poetic Language, is basically our roadmap here. And in it, she puts forward this fascinating idea that our entire sense of self, who we think we are, is formed by this constant push and pull between two totally different realms of experience. And this chart lays it out perfectly. On the left, you have the semiotic. Just think of this as the raw, chaotic energy that exists before language. You know, bodily drives, rhythms, all the experiences we have as infants before we can actually name them. Then, on the right, you have the symbolic. This is the world of rules, grammar, and social order that we're all born into. It's the system that gives things meaning and tells us who we are. So the really crucial part is how these two realms interact. Our everyday structured world, the symbolic, is constantly being pushed and prodded by these primal energies from the semiotic. Kristeva said that when that pressure gets strong enough, it can actually crack the surface of conventional meaning. And right there, in that moment of disruption, totally new possibilities for thought can rush in. Okay, so if this disruption is the goal, where does it actually happen? For Kristeva, the answer isn't in the streets, it's on the page. Right. Kristeva argued that this revolution happens in art, specifically in what we call avant-garde literature and poetry. You know, those experimental texts that intentionally play with language, break all the grammatical rules, and just push the boundaries of what we think is normal. For her, these texts are the places where the raw energy of the semiotic can literally burst through the cracks of the symbolic. And she wasn't just speaking in hypotheticals. She pointed to very specific examples, like the super complex poetry of Mallarmé or the boundary-shattering novels of James Joyce, as places where you can actually see this linguistic revolution happening in real time. And this all builds to her final, really powerful point. This isn't just about making weird, interesting art. As Kristeva herself puts it, the whole goal is to produce a different kind of subject. In other words, by creating a new kind of language, you can actually create a new kind of person, someone who thinks differently and is therefore capable of building a different kind of society. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? It really boils down to a simple but pretty profound idea. Language is power. The core argument here is that by disrupting the very language that holds our social structures together, you can start to break those structures down from the inside out, opening up entirely new ways of seeing the world and ourselves. Which leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Is it actually possible? Can changing the way we write, the very words we use, truly lead to changing the way we live? It's a question that really challenges us to think about that deep, often invisible connection between our words and our world.
यूपीआई पेमेंट फेल हो गया, इसलिए बर्तन मांजना पड़ रहा है। अकाउंट में बैलेंस नहीं था, दोस्त कह रहा था स्लाइस यूपीआई क्रेडिट कार्ड यूज किया करो, नहीं सुना। सेम यूपीआई जैसे स्कैन करना होता है, बस पैसे आपके अकाउंट से नहीं क्रेडिट कार्ड से कटते हैं। बस नॉर्मल यूपीआई की तरह स्कैन करो, पे करो और बाद में रीपे करो। नो ज्वाइनिंग फी, नो एनुअल फी, नो हिडन चार्ज। ऊपर से हर ट्रांजैक्शन पे अप टू 3% तक का कैशबैक। दोस्त का सुन लेना चाहिए। तो जहाँ भी यूपीआई चलाते हो वहाँ पे स्लाइस चलाओ।
मार्केट में एक मूव आता है और आप 3 स्क्रीन्स देख रहे होते हो, पोजीशंस अलग जगह, पीएनएल कहीं और ऑप्शन चेन एक और टैब में। ग्रो पर ट्रेडिंग होती है एक ही स्क्रीन पर। ऑप्शन चेन से ही कॉल और पुट एनालाइज करो, ओआई चेक करो और डायरेक्ट वहीं से ऑर्डर प्लेस करो। अपने ओपन पोजीशंस और लाइव पीएनएल एक ही स्क्रीन पर ट्रैक करो। जब सब कुछ सामने होता है ना, तो डिसीजन लेना क्विक हो जाता है। डाउनलोड ग्रो।
Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever stopped to wonder why so many of the books we call classics were written by, well, men? Or how just one idea can totally change the way we read, forever? Today, we're diving into the story of American feminist literary criticism. This was a movement that didn't just add a few women to the syllabus, it completely rewrote the rules of the game. All right, let's set the scene. It's the 1960s. And for so many American women, there was this strange feeling, a kind of quiet desperation. On the surface, everything looked fine. But underneath, there was what this quote calls the problem that has no name. It's this deep, unsettling sense that you're being held back, kept from becoming who you're meant to be, all because you're living out a role someone else wrote for you. You know, that kind of private frustration can only stay private for so long before it just has to explode. And the 1960s, the air was already electric with the civil rights movement, which gave people a real roadmap for how to challenge the system. Then boom, 1963, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, just hits the scene. It takes that unnamed problem, gives it a name, and suddenly it's not just a personal feeling anymore. It's a national conversation. It's a movement. And what is just incredible is how fast everything happened. Just look at this timeline. It's an absolute explosion of ideas. Friedan kicks the door open in 63, and then bam, 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 you get these landmark texts, one after another. Thinkers like Millett and Firestone aren't just commenting, they're building the entire intellectual framework for a revolution in under a decade. It's just staggering. Okay, so you've got the energy, you've got the momentum, but to really fight a revolution, you need more than just passion. You need a new vocabulary. The old ways of talking about the world just weren't cutting it anymore. They couldn't describe the power structures these women were starting to see so clearly, so they had to invent new tools, new words, to take the world apart and understand how it was built. And this right here, this is one of the most powerful game-changing ideas to come out of the whole movement. The idea that we have to separate biological sex from socially constructed gender. Just let that sink in for a second. What it means is that all the things we're told women should be or how they should act isn't baked into our DNA. It's a cultural script. And the best part about a script, it can be rewritten. So once you have that new lens, a word like patriarchy totally changes. It stops being this vague idea of, oh, that's just how things are, and it becomes a political system. You can see it as an actual institution, one designed to keep power in the hands of men. And what's one of its most powerful tools? Culture. All those books and stories that we grow up with, the ones that subtly teach us about the world and, a woman's place in it. Okay, so with these new concepts of gender and patriarchy in their toolbox, something really fascinating started to happen. The focus shifted. It wasn't just about criticizing how male authors wrote about women anymore. No, it became an active search, almost like a form of literary archaeology, to go back and dig up this entire lost tradition of women writers who'd been ignored or just plain erased by history. And all of a sudden, these incredible books start popping up. Works like The Mad Woman in the Attic literally started building a whole new section in the Library of Literary History, one packed with these brilliant forgotten women. But as this new canon started to take shape, a new question came up. Is there a bigger pattern here? Can we actually map out the evolution of this hidden tradition? And that is exactly what Elaine Shawletter set out to do. So, Shawletter came up with this really elegant three-phase model to explain it all. First, she said you have the feminine phase. This is where women were basically writing by the rules of the male literary world. Then you get the feminist phase, a period of protest, of pushing back against those rules. And finally, you arrive at the female phase, where it's all about self-discovery and carving out a space for a uniquely female voice. But the story doesn't stop there, not by a long shot, because like any truly powerful idea, feminist criticism kept evolving. Once that initial foundation was in place, the movement started to look in the mirror. It began asking itself much harder questions, challenging its own assumptions, and becoming way more complex. And the conversation just got so much richer, Critics started tackling these really big questions, like, is there such a thing as a female language, a way of writing that's fundamentally different from the male tradition? How does feminism connect with these huge philosophical movements happening at the same time? The movement was growing up, and these were its fascinating growing pains. And here's where we get to what is maybe the most important evolution of all, a challenge that came from inside the movement itself. For all of its amazing, groundbreaking work, the early movement had a pretty big blind spot. It mainly focused on the experiences of white, middle-class women. And so this powerful, necessary call came from other women to ask, hey, whose feminism are we talking about here? And who's being left out of the picture? This is really where thinkers like Barbara Smith and Alice Walker became absolutely essential. When you read something like In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, you realize they weren't just adding more voices to the choir, they were weaving completely new histories. They showed the world that womanhood isn't just one single story. It's this beautiful, complex tapestry. And by searching for their own roots, as this quote so beautifully puts it, they ended up making the garden bigger and more beautiful for everyone.
So when you look back, this whole journey from a quiet problem with no name to this dynamic, self-questioning field of study, it really did change everything. It gave us a new language to ask new questions and the tools to find new answers. So the next time you pick up a book or even just watch a movie, think about it. The way you see that story has been shaped by the legacy of these critics. And it leaves us all with a pretty big question. What other stories are still out there, just waiting to be told?
मार्केट चाहे गिर रहा हो या ऊपर जा रहा हो, मुझे इस चीज का बिल्कुल फर्क नहीं पड़ता, क्योंकि मेरी इनकम हर महीने फिक्स आती है और ये कोई जॉब, साइड हसल या ट्रेडिंग का जुगाड़ नहीं है। ये एक्चुअली मेरी एफडी से आती है। जी हाँ, एक ऐसी एफडी जो आपको मंथली पे आउट देती है और ये आपको मिलती है स्टेबल मनी ऐप पर। देखो, नॉर्मल एफडीज में क्या होता है, आप पैसा डालते हो एंड पूरा टेन्योर वेट करना पड़ता है एंड लास्ट में आपको प्रिंसिपल प्लस इंटरेस्ट एक साथ मिलता है, मतलब मैच्योरिटी तक कैश फ्लोज जीरो। इसका इंटरेस्ट हर महीने डायरेक्ट आपके बैंक अकाउंट में आ जाता है, बिल्कुल एक क्रेडिटेबल सैलरी की तरह। और सेफ्टी भी टॉप नॉच है, क्योंकि 5 लाख तक की एफडी DICGC इंश्योरेंस के अंडर कवर हो जाती है, मतलब रिस्क प्रैक्टिकली ना के बराबर। अब मैं क्या करता हूँ, स्टेबल मनी ऐप ओपन करता हूँ, डिफरेंट बैंक्स की मंथली पे आउट एफडी रेट एक ही जगह कंपेयर करता हूँ, बेस्ट ऑप्शन चूज करता हूँ, डिजिटल KYC करता हूँ और एफडी बुक हो जाती है, वो भी बिना बैंक जाए। और सबसे बड़ी बात, जो इंटरेस्ट रेट आपने चूज किया है वो पूरे टेन्योर के लिए लॉक हो जाता है, मतलब बीच में रेट्स गिर भी गए तो भी आपका रिटर्न सेम ही रहेगा। प्लस टेन्योर फ्लेक्सिबल होता है और पे आउट्स, रिन्यूअल्स, मैच्योरिटी।
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really powerful critique of a major intellectual movement. You know, one that questioned everything, but maybe, just maybe, it forgot to check who was actually in the room when it did. So let's just start with this question because it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. What happens when a theory that's supposed to be all about celebrating difference ends up creating its own kind of exclusion? All right, first things first, let's get our terms straight. Postmodernism. This was a pretty revolutionary movement in thought. Its whole goal was to take on what it called master narratives. You know, those big one-size-fits-all stories about progress, truth, and history. Instead, it was all about emphasizing difference and questioning any idea that claimed to be the final, stable truth. But for all its promise, a really crucial voice stepped up and pointed out a fundamental problem with this new way of thinking. Turns out, not everyone felt included in this big celebration of difference. And this is where the incredible feminist scholar and activist Bell Hooks enters the picture. And yeah, you'll see her name is always in lowercase. That was totally intentional. She wanted the focus to be on her ideas, on the substance of her work, not on her as a personality. This quote, I mean, it just cuts right to the heart of the problem, doesn't it? Hooks argued that for all its talk about difference, postmodernism was seriously failing in practice. It wasn't engaging with the work of Black writers and thinkers, and so it became, in her own powerful words, a discourse dominated by white male voices. And this just lays out that central contradiction so clearly. On one hand, the promise was amazing. Celebrate difference, deconstruct power, challenge those old stories. But the reality, as Hooks showed, was that it was ignoring Black voices and creating these new kind of subtle forms of exclusion within academia. So you might be thinking, okay, but why was this so important? I mean, what were the real world stakes here? This sounds like a pretty academic debate, right? Well, here's why it mattered so much. The timing was everything. Postmodernism started critiquing the very idea of a stable identity at the exact same time that Black people were in the middle of forming what Hooks called a radical Black subjectivity, a brand new, powerful, and collective sense of self. And Hooks was really clear that this wasn't just some abstract philosophical argument. No, this was deeply tied to a lived reality, to the ongoing social conditions where the collective African-American experience was still one of, and I'm quoting here, continued displacement, profound alienation, and despair. You can imagine that feeling of hopelessness created this deep yearning, a real hunger for a critical voice, for a framework that could actually help make sense of that experience, especially when all the old master narratives were being torn to shreds. But here's what's so brilliant about what Hooks did. She didn't just want to tear postmodernism down. Her goal was to rebuild it, to radically reimagine it into something that could be genuinely useful for marginalized communities. She basically said, look, the core tools of this movement, like its critique of essentialism, you know, the idea that a group of people has some fixed, unchanging essence, that stuff could be incredibly powerful if we just applied it correctly. It could be used to promote the idea of multiple Black identities, to fight back against that single monolithic view that often comes from colonial thinking. And it could help us finally see the deep connections between race and class. For any of this to work, though, one concept was absolutely key: the authority of experience. Hooks argued that these academic theories had to be grounded in the lived reality of oppressed people. Your personal experience wasn't just a story, it was a valid, crucial source of knowledge. Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. How does this fit into a bigger picture? Well, Hooke's work isn't in a vacuum. It's actually a vital part of the foundation for modern feminism. See, a lot like how Hooks pushed postmodernism to be better, modern feminism isn't just about a single issue. It's about questioning those fixed ideas of gender, taking a hard look at the category of woman itself, and, this is so important, exploring all the intersections of gender with class and race. It's about analyzing how power works and how our very sense of self is put together. So what's the big takeaway here? The legacy of bell hooks' critique is really this powerful framework for connecting the dots. It teaches us that race, class, and gender aren't these separate, isolated issues. They are deeply interconnected systems of power, and you have to understand them together. And that leaves us with one last, really provocative thought, one that brings her critique right into our world today. As we navigate all of our big conversations about technology, politics, culture, we have to ask ourselves, whose voices are we still not hearing?
Shopping at rupees 2000 and SIP at just rupees 100. Open free Demat account.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all the scheme-related documents carefully.
$300 பட்ஜெட்ல ஒரு ஒயிட் ஷூ சொல்லுங்க ப்ரோ. சொல்லிட்டா போச்சு. அதுக்கு முன்னாடி நான் இந்த ஷூவை ஆல்ரெடி 1 year 5 months யூஸ் பண்ணிட்டு தான் இருக்கேன். அதுவும் வெறும் 260 rupeesக்கே நான் வாங்கியிருந்தேன். ஸோ அதே பிராண்ட்ல நம்ம இன்னொரு ஷூ வாங்கிட்டோம். பட் இதோட பிரைஸ் பாத்தீங்கன்னா வெறும் 300 rupees தான் இப்ப சேல் ஆயிட்டு இருக்கு. கண்டிப்பா நம்ம பட்ஜெட்ல இது வந்துடும். என்னோட போட்டோஸ்லாம் நீங்க பாத்தீங்கன்னா அதிகமா எல்லா ட்ரெஸ்க்குமே நான் இந்த ஒயிட் ஷூ தான் போட்டிருப்பேன். பிகாஸ் நம்ம எந்த ட்ரெஸ் வியர் பண்ணாலும் ஒயிட் ஷூ மேட்ச் பண்ணோம்னா பார்க்க செம்ம லுக்கா இருக்கும். அதுவும் இந்த ஷூ பாத்தீங்கன்னா பிளிப்கார்ட்ல 94,000 கஸ்டமர் ரிவ்யூஸ் வாங்கியிருக்கு. ரொம்ப முக்கியமா சைஸ் 10 வரைக்குமே அவைலபிலிட்டி இருக்கு. அண்ட் ஃபைனலா வெறும் 300 பட்ஜெட்ல 4 star ரேட்டிங்ல ஒரு நல்ல கஸ்டமர் ரிவ்யூஸ்ல 10 days ரிட்டர்ன் பாலிசி இருக்கிற கேஷ் ஆன் டெலிவரி ஆப்ஷனும் கொடுத்திருக்க ஒரு நல்ல ஷூ உங்களுக்கு வேணும்னா நீங்க ஃபாலோ பண்ணிட்டு ஷூன்னு கமெண்ட் பண்ணுங்க. அந்த ஷூவோட லிங்கை நான் உங்களுக்கு டிஎம்ல சென்ட் பண்ணிடுவேன்.
All right, today we're tackling a big one, postmodernism. Now, I know that word can sound a little intimidating, right? But it's really just about the huge sweeping stories every culture tells itself. You know, stories about progress, about reason, and about some kind of perfect future. But what happens when we start to doubt those stories? I mean, have you ever had that feeling that the big stories you grew up with, you know, the ones that said everything is always getting better, that history is moving in one straight line, that maybe they don't quite add up anymore? Well, that feeling, that little bit of skepticism, that's exactly what we're digging into today.
So there's a fancy word for these big stories. It's meta-narrative. Think of it as the one story to rule them all. It's this grand, all-encompassing explanation that tries to make sense of, well, everything, by pointing us all toward one single universal goal. These are those glossy, utopian visions of the future we've all seen a million times. To make this real, let's look at two of the heavy hitters from the modern era, liberal humanism and Marxism. So, liberal humanism tells the story about how we can all be free through the power of reason. Marxism tells a story about how we can all be free through economic and class struggle. You see, they're both these huge, powerful narratives that promise one single path to a better world for everyone. And if you're wondering where these giant ideas came from, well, it's no surprise. They were basically born from the Enlightenment, that amazing revolutionary period in history that put all its faith in logic and progress to solve all of humanity's problems. The whole project was built on this belief that there was one rational, correct way forward. So who was the person who really put his finger on this growing disbelief? Who gave it a name? Well, that brings us to the philosopher at the heart of our story today, Jean-François Lyotard. Now, Lyotard wasn't just some thinker locked away in an ivory tower. His ideas were really shaped by what was happening in the world. He saw the massive student protests in Paris in 1968. He was an activist fighting against French colonialism. And you can see how these experiences made him really, really skeptical of any system or any theory that claimed it had the one and only answer for everybody. And in his game-changing 1979 book, The Postmodern Condition, he just boils it all down to this one brilliantly simple definition. He says postmodernism is just this: incredulity toward meta-narratives. That's it. It's that moment when the epic utopian music just stops. It's when that perfect glossy picture of the future starts to crack. And let's be super clear about that word incredulity. It doesn't mean being cynical or just negative for the sake of it. It's simply about a growing skepticism. It's that moment when you stop and ask, hang on, does that one big story really explain everything for everyone? It's just a loss of that blind faith. Okay, so what happens then? What does it actually look and feel like when a whole culture starts to feel this way? What is this postmodern condition? Let's break it down. Lyotard points to three big things. First, we start to reject the idea of universal progress. In art and culture, you see this thing called bricolage. Just think of a movie like Pulp Fiction, where it's mixing up old gangster movies, westerns, and all sorts of other styles. Second, there's a loss of faith that big things like technology or freedom are automatically good for everybody in the same way. And third, we start to question the very foundations. Art and books begin to ask, hey, are the rules we built this world on actually fair? So the crucial point here is that the one giant single story shatters. And what we're left with is more like a mosaic, a collection of countless smaller, local, fragmented stories. It's not about finding the one universal truth anymore, but about trying to make sense of a world that has many truths, all existing at once. Okay, so why does any of this matter? I mean, who cares, right? Well, it's so important because it's not just some abstract theory. It completely changes how we see the world. And according to Lyotard, that change, it isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. Lyotard actually argued that this whole mindset isn't about chaos. It's about developing a kind of empathy. It makes us more sensitive to differences, and it makes us better at tolerating things that just don't fit into our neat little boxes. He calls these the incommensurable. Things you can't measure with the same ruler. It's not trying to say whether an apple is better than an orange. They're just different. So at the end of the day, this whole postmodern idea isn't about destroying truth or saying nothing is real. It's really a call for a little humility. It's about being cautious, being wary of any single story from anywhere that claims it has all the answers for everyone. And instead, to start actually listening to all the other stories that the big loud one might have drowned out. And that leaves us with one last massive question for you to think about. If those huge, all-powerful stories are fading away, if that one single path forward has disappeared, what are we left with? What are the smaller, more personal stories that we use to build our world, our communities, our own identities today? What stories matter?
सर ₹1 आप सीखो ऐप को देके डेली का 3000 कमाना सीख सकते हैं। अगर बिल गेट्स कर सकते हैं, रतन टाटा कर सकते हैं।
Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to step through the looking glass into a world that, well, it probably feels strangely familiar. A world of absolutely flawless images, perfectly curated lives, and that nagging feeling that reality itself has been upgraded. What if the copy is actually better than the original now? I mean, just look around. On your screen, on billboards, just scrolling through your feed. Everything is so glossy, so perfect. Maybe a little too perfect, right? These hyper-realistic 3D graphics, these impossibly polished photos, they kind of force you to ask a really basic question. Is any of this even real anymore? You know that feeling I'm talking about, where the copies of things, the images, the symbols, the logos, they start to feel more important, more real than the actual things they're supposed to represent? Well, that feeling has a name. Welcome to the hyper-real. It's this place where the map hasn't just replaced the territory. It's become the only territory we know. And what's really fascinating here is that this isn't just some new sci-fi idea. Nope, this is a whole theory from a thinker who pretty much saw all of this coming decades ago. He argued that we're just surrounded by this constant flood of images that don't just reflect our world, they're actively creating a new one, a better one, and offering themselves up in place of the real thing. So the man behind these totally mind-bending ideas was the French sociologist Jean Baudrillard. And he wasn't just some stuffy academic. People have called him the high priest, even the prophet of postmodernism, because he had this almost uncanny ability to diagnose the strange new reality that was taking shape all around us. And Baudrillard's own intellectual journey is pretty amazing. He starts out back in 1968, right in the middle of the Paris student revolts. His early stuff was all Marxist, critiquing consumerism. But then by 1973, he makes this huge radical break. He basically said, hey, Marx was wrong to focus only on who owns the factories, the production. Baudrillard saw that the real power was shifting to whoever controls the images and the signs. And that realization, that became the foundation for his most famous work in 1983's Simulations, which is basically the blueprint for the hyper-real world we're living in right now. Okay, so how do we even get our heads around this? Well, Baudrillard gives us a brand new language with 3 key concepts that are kind of like a decoder ring for the modern world. And trust me, once you get these, you are going to start seeing them absolutely everywhere. First up, simulacra. Okay, here's the crazy twist. These are copies of things that have no original. Yeah, think about a perfectly rendered dragon in a movie. It's a flawless image, right? A perfect copy of something that never, ever existed. Simulacra are the building blocks of the hyperreal. Next, you've got simulation. So if simulacra are the bricks, then simulation is the act of building the house. It's the whole process of generating a new reality from these models that have no origin. We're not just looking at fake images anymore. We are literally living inside the process where the symbols of reality have become more important than reality itself. And all of that brings us to our final destination, the hyper-real. This is the world where the simulation is so complete, so totally immersive, that we don't even notice the difference anymore. It's a reality built entirely from models, leaving us, in Baudrillard's really haunting phrase, with the desert of the real itself. I know, this all sounds pretty abstract, doesn't it? So let's make it concrete. Let's use Baudrillard's most famous and probably most provocative example to see how this all works in the world. Or, what's left of it. Let's talk about Disneyland. And here it is. This is Baudrillard's bombshell argument. He says Disneyland isn't just a fun theme park. No, its true function is ideological. He says it's there to make us believe that everything outside its walls, all the rest of America, is real by comparison. This chart just breaks it down perfectly. We think of Disneyland as the fantasy, right? The cartoon world we escape to. But Baudrillard completely flips it. He argues the real illusion is the idea that the rest of America isn't also a simulation. For him, a society obsessed with simple stories and consumer fantasy, what he called an infantilized culture, is the true simulation. Disneyland is just the alibi, the thing that makes everything else seem authentic. So what happens when this kind of logic escapes the theme park? Well, for Baudrillard, it already has. The principles of Disneyland haven't stayed behind those gates. They've spilled out and, well, they've kind of consumed everything. And this logic just thrives in our consumer society. Baudrillard argues our entire social world isn't organized around genuine human needs or relationships anymore. Nope. It's organized by what he calls a system of objects. And think about it, it makes sense. Our identities, our social status, even our self-worth, it's all defined by what we buy, what we own, and what we want. It's a competition based on consumption, not on creation. And if you look around today, his predictions are just eerily on point. I mean, think about reality TV shows that simulate human drama, news channels that create these perfect, digestible narratives instead of just giving us raw facts, social media feeds that simulate friendship and community, even wars, which are so often presented to us as these clean, spectacular media events, totally detached from their awful reality. The entire landscape is a simulation. And that brings us right back to his powerful and frankly chilling conclusion. If our reality has been replaced by this endless stream of codes and signs and manufactured images, if the map is now the only territory we have, then we are truly living in the world he described. We have inherited the desert of the real. So the takeaway here isn't just some complicated academic theory. It's really a new lens for seeing our own world a little more clearly. And it leaves all of us with one final, unavoidable question to chew on. If this is the simulation, then what exactly is real?
Looking for a smarter way to analyze and place your FN orders? Just switch to Grow's advanced option sheet. एक ही स्क्रीन पर ओपन इंटरेस्ट, ग्रीक्स और वॉलेटिलिटी एनालाइज करो, फिर वहीं से डायरेक्टली स्ट्राइक चूज करो और बास्केट और नॉर्मल ऑर्डर प्लेस कर दो विदाउट स्विचिंग स्क्रीन. अपनी ट्रेडिंग ग्रो करो और ऐप डाउनलोड करो.
Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.
Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're jumping right into a massive intellectual fight, a battle over the very idea of progress itself. Is this whole modern world we've built sitting on a solid foundation? Or is it maybe an incomplete or even a failed project? Let's get into it. Just think about that for a second. What if all the big ideas that shaped our democracies, our science, our art, what if they were all fundamentally flawed from the start? That's the huge provocative question at the center of the debate we're unpacking today. It really challenges everything we think we know about how to move forward as a society. So here's our game plan. We're going to meet the defender, then look at the original promise he's fighting for. We'll see how that vision got fractured and how reason itself ended up on trial. Then we'll check out the proposed way forward and, most importantly, talk about why it matters for all of us right now. All right, so the main character in our story is the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. You can kind of think of him as a modern-day champion for those classic Enlightenment ideals, really pushing back against a huge wave of skepticism. Now, Habermas has spent his entire career defending the idea of liberal democracy. He was part of this super influential group called the Frankfurt School, but really his life's work has been all about trying to rescue and re-energize the Enlightenment's belief in reason, in justice, and in the idea that, yes, we can actually make things better. Okay, to really get what he's talking about, you need to know one of his most famous ideas, the public sphere. This is basically the space where we all talk, debate, and form opinions. Think about your social media feeds, the news you watch, even just community groups in your town. For Habermas, a healthy public sphere is literally the lifeblood of democracy, and it's all powered by our ability to reason with each other. So what is this project that Habermas is trying so hard to defend? Well, to understand that, we have to rewind and look at the original vision from the Enlightenment philosophers. You have to understand the goal here was massive. The Enlightenment thinkers believed that all this knowledge we were gaining from science, from art, from philosophy, it wasn't just supposed to sit in a book. It was all meant to work together, to help us understand the world, understand ourselves, push us to be better people, and ultimately build a more just world for everyone. It was this beautiful, unified idea. But that grand, unified vision, it didn't last. A crack started to show up in the foundation of this whole project. And funnily enough, it started in the world of art. Right around the middle of the 1800s, things started to fall apart. These different fields of knowledge, science, morality, art, they all started drifting away from each other. They got super specialized, stuck in their own little bubbles, and they lost that connection to the bigger mission of human progress. Art, especially, started to turn inward. It became all about art for art's sake. It was more focused on its own rules, its own history. It was basically talking to itself. It wasn't really concerned with the big questions of truth or justice in the real world anymore. It just got disconnected. And this split, this fragmentation, it set the stage for an even bigger challenge. A new wave of thinkers came along, the Post-Structuralists, and they decided to put the entire idea of Enlightenment reason on trial. They looked at all those grand promises of progress and started asking some really tough questions. And this slide right here, this is the absolute heart of the conflict. For the Enlightenment tradition, reason was our best shot at freedom and justice. But its critics, they saw something totally different. They argued that reason isn't some pure, neutral thing. They saw it as a tool of power, one that has been used to push a specific, often Western worldview while calling everything else irrational. And yeah, they did not pull any punches. They saw the whole Enlightenment project not as something that frees people, but as a kind of sneaky form of control. To them, its claim to universal truth was a kind of terroristic reason that just silenced other cultures and other ways of thinking. A really powerful accusation. So, facing this incredibly fierce critique, what does Habermas do? Does he just throw in the towel and abandon the whole project? Not a chance. Instead, he comes up with a whole new way to think about what reason even is. And this is his big idea, communicative reason. He says, look, reason isn't some abstract thing floating in the clouds, and it's not just a weapon. Reason is something we create together. It's baked into the simple act of trying to understand each other when we talk. If you and I are trying to agree on something, and we're both giving our reasons, listening, and actually willing to be convinced by the better argument, well, that whole process is communicative reason. So based on that idea, he lays out a path for how we can fix that cultural fracture we were talking about. Step 1. Art and culture need to stop being so self-obsessed. Step 2, they have to start dealing with the big questions of truth and justice again. And finally, step 3, we need to bring these separate worlds, art, science, and morality, back together into one meaningful whole, just like the Enlightenment wanted in the first place. I know. This can all seem like a really abstract philosophical argument, but Habermas insists that this stuff has huge consequences for our everyday lives and for society as a whole. Because here's the real payoff. If we can actually achieve communicative reason, then that makes communicative action possible. That means we can move beyond just arguing and actually start working together to solve real problems, whether it's an issue in your local community or a massive global challenge. It's basically a blueprint for how we can make progress together. And that kind of leaves us with one last pretty urgent question. In our world today, a world of social media echo chambers and deep political divisions, could Habermas be right? Is the key to our future not some grand new ideology, but something much simpler and yet way harder? Just the act of communicating, of reasoning together. The project of modernity might be incomplete, but maybe, just maybe, the tools we need to finish it are right there, in the conversations we choose to have.
मार्केट चाहे गिर रहा हो या फिर ऊपर जा रहा हो, मुझे इस चीज का बिल्कुल भी फर्क नहीं पड़ता, क्योंकि मेरी इनकम तो हर महीने फिक्स आती है और ये कोई जॉब, साइड हसल या ट्रेडिंग का जुगाड़ नहीं है। ये एक्चुअली में मेरी एफडीज है। जी हाँ, ऐसी एफडी जो आपको मंथली पे आउट देती है ना, आपको मिलेगी स्टेबल मनी पे। देखो, नॉर्मल एफडी में क्या होता है, आप पैसा डालते हो और पूरा टेन्योर आपको वेट करना होता है और एंड में आपको प्रिंसिपल और इंटरेस्ट रेट इकट्ठा मिलता है, लेकिन कैश फ्लो 0 टिल मैच्योरिटी। लेकिन मंथली पे आउट एफडीज का सीन एकदम सिंपल है। इसका इंटरेस्ट हर महीने आपके बैंक अकाउंट में डायरेक्टली क्रेडिट होता है। जैसे एक सेकेंड, प्रेडिक्टेबल सैलरी और सेफ्टी भी टॉप नॉच मिलती है, क्योंकि 5 लाख रुपए तक की एफडी DICGC के अंडर इंश्योर्ड होती है, यानी रिस्क प्रैक्टिकली ना के बराबर है। अब मैं क्या करता हूँ, सबसे पहले स्टेबल मनी ऐप ओपन करता हूँ, फिर अलग अलग बैंक्स की मंथली पे आउट एफडी रेट्स को एक ही जगह पे कंपेयर करता हूँ, बेस्ट वाला ऑप्शन चूज करता हूँ, फिर डिजिटल KYC कराता हूँ और एफडी बुक हो जाती है, वो भी बिना ब्रांच जाए। और सबसे खास बात, जो भी इंटरेस्ट रेट आप चूज करते हो वो पूरे टेन्योर तक लॉक्ड रहती है। मतलब अगर बीच में रेट गिर भी गया तो आपका रिटर्न सेम रहेगा, प्लस टेन्योर भी आपके हिसाब से फ्लेक्सिबल। और सबसे कन्वीनियंट पार्ट, पे आउट्स, मंथली रिन्यूअल्स, मैच्योरिटी सब एक ही डैशबोर्ड पे ट्रैक होता है। पूरी एफडी का कंट्रोल लिटरली आपके फोन पे। तो अगर आपको लो रिस्क पे मंथली रेगुलर इनकम चाहिए, मंथली पे आउट एफडीज ऑनेस्टली एक स्ट्रॉन्ग ऑप्शन है स्टेबल मनी ऐप पे।
Mintra, fashion shopping app. Download now.
All right, let's talk about a word you've probably heard thrown around a ton, but maybe you're not totally sure what it means. Postmodernism. It's one of those ideas that seems to pop up everywhere, describing art, buildings, even our own social media feeds. So, let's break it down. You ever find yourself scrolling, or watching the news, and you get this weird feeling, this sense that everything is just a performance, that reality itself feels like it's being built, with these slick, glossy, almost too real images right in front of your eyes? Well, that exact feeling is what we're going to get into today. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to try and pin down what postmodern actually means. Then we'll look at the world it grew out of, unpack its biggest and most challenging ideas, see how it completely tore up the art world's rulebook, and then we'll bring it all together to see why it matters so much right now. Okay, let's dive right in. First things first. So what are we really talking about when we say postmodernism? Well, the thing is, it's not just one single thing. The best way to get a handle on it is to think of it in 3 different but totally connected registers. There's the historical era it happened in, the mind-bending theories that tried to explain that era, and of course, the art that gave it a voice. We're going to look at all 3.
But before we can get into the theories, we really have to understand the world that cooked them up. See, postmodernism didn't just fall out of the sky. It was a direct response to some massive world-altering changes.